All right, still in Domain 1, Security and Risk Management, but now we're going to get into one of our biggest topics of the domain and probably perhaps one of the largest, certainly the most important section of Domain 1. When people think of Domain 1, as the name implies, Security and Risk Management, this is really the meat of the domain, or the biggest component of the domain. So what is risk management? Risk management is the process that you put into place within the organization of assessing, minimizing, preventing accidental loss to the business with insurance, safety measures, etc. Assessing the risk to the organization, hopefully implementing some sort of control to minimize the risk to the organization, preventing accidental loss, etc. Now, it can include a lot of other things, but by definition, the whole point of assessing risk is to eventually reduce that risk. Again, we can't get it down to zero, but we can mitigate it to acceptable levels. Coordinated and economical application of resources to minimize, to monitor, to control the probability and the impact of unfortunate events. So risk management is not simply about reducing the likelihood of a cyber attack or a threat against the organization from an actor, an attacker, but also considering all kinds of threats to the organization. Strategies to manage threats could be transferring the threat to another party, avoiding the threat altogether, reducing the negative effect or the probability, so reducing the impact or the likelihood, accepting the risk, and so on. So we will talk about risk appetite a little bit later on. We'll talk about transfer, acceptance, avoidance, mitigation, and other kind of threat positions that risk positions that we can take within our organization. So risk management is involves assessing the risk to the organization, identifying assets, analyzing that risk, reducing the risk by putting in some sort of control, or transferring the risk. There's different positions that we can take, but we will get into the details of that as we go through this process. Now, the Nist risk assessment process, pretty much a framework for assessing risk within an organization, very similar to many other types of risk assessment frameworks that exist. Essentially, you're going to see that these models that we're going to be talking about throughout this section, if you will, they're all going to have similarities in how we handle risk, and specifically with regard to IT or information technology. So step one, we prepare for the assessment, and that preparation depends on the framework that we have in place, what type of framework that we're going to utilize for the assessment within our organization. Preparing for the assessment would be, part of that would be identifying the assets within the organization, understanding what it is that we're trying to protect. Based on that, we conduct our assessment. Who are the threat sources? What are the threat events that we're concerned about? What we call the threat scape or threat landscape. Identify the vulnerabilities and the predisposing conditions in the assets that we identified in step one that threats could take advantage of, or threat actors could take advantage of to realize or to impact our organization. What is the likelihood that that particular threat event might occur, or that type of attack might occur? What is the impact to the organization if that were to occur? And then that ultimately defines what the residual risk is to the organization. Once we've done that, we can then communicate those results to the shareholders, to the stakeholders, to the powers that be, and then we can go through the process of mitigation. Now, the Nist risk assessment process does not define the mitigation techniques or the mitigation position. It's just the assessment process. And there are multiple frameworks defined within Nist that define how these assessments are to take place. And we'll talk about that as we go through this section. So what is the risk management process? We have to establish the context of our assessment. What are the policies? What are the requirements to conduct the assessment? What assessment method are we going to use? Is there a specific framework that we're going to use to establish the assessment? What is the method of assessing the organization that we're going to use? What are the risk factors? What is included within the scope of the assessment? All right. So we need to identify what the purpose of the assessment is. It could be a macro assessment that looks at the whole organization, or it could be a micro assessment that looks at a component or a division of the organization, which then feeds into our overall policy. So the scope is really important to identify because these assessments can be quite in-depth and detailed. You want to limit the scope of that assessment to what your goals are. Identify the assumptions and the constraints within the assessment. An assumption or a constraint might be, we understand that we're running this legacy operating system, but we do not have the option. Our software only works in this legacy operating system, and the software is critical to our business. That would be an assumption or a constraint that you could apply. Identify information sources as inputs for the assessment data. Could be subject matter experts, department heads, engineers, human resources individuals, legal counsel, etc. Identify the risk model and the analytic approach that you're going to use. There are actually many different predefined risk assessment models that exist, and we will talk about many of them throughout this section here. The assessment should produce a list of security risks so that we can prioritize the risk level and develop our risk response decisions, ultimately resulting in our risk appetite, or our risk position, I guess we should say, based on our appetite. We have to identify threats and vulnerabilities. We have to identify the impact and the likelihood and uncertainty associated with the process. Okay? Meaning that as we go through the assessment process, there may be areas of concern that we cannot fully address because we simply don't have enough information. And that would probably relate to identifying active threats. Maybe it's a little bit easier to identify vulnerabilities, but there are certainly threats that haven't been even identified yet, zero-day threats that we're unable to classify or identify or protect against. The goal, of course, in this whole risk management process is to cover the entire risk space with definitions, guidance, and directions from the prepare step that we saw in the previous slide. All right, who are the threat sources? And again, do not think of this only from the perspective of technology assets. You need to think of this from the perspective of physical assets, intellectual property, certainly technical assets, resources within the organization, hard resources as well as soft resources, anything that would hinder the operation of the business and so on. What are the threat events that we need to protect against? What are the circumstances, or what or the event? What are the events with the potential to cause harm to the organization? We need to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited. by threat sources through threat events and predisposed conditions. This is actually a pretty important bullet point because it really ties everything together. Just because there's a threat source and there is a associated threat event doesn't necessarily mean that it's defined as a significant concern to our organization, because we may not have vulnerabilities in place that would make us vulnerable to that particular threat source or threat event. All right. We need to determine the likelihood that identified threat sources would result in a threat event and the likelihood of success based on our vulnerabilities, based on the systems. For example, if we've identified that a threat source is related to Windows 7 or Windows 8 or even Windows 10 now because they have Windows 11, we'll say Windows 10, right? And the threat event is related to Windows 10, but we've upgraded all of our computers to Windows 11, we may not be as concerned about that particular threat source because the likelihood of success is pretty minimal considering that we don't have any Windows 10 computers, if that makes sense. All right. Determine the adverse impacts to the operations and assets, to the individuals, to the organization, to the nation from the exploitation of vulnerabilities by the threat sources. So we've already seen in the last two bullet points, likelihood and impact, right? Likelihood and impact, the two biggest elements or the two key elements to any threat analysis or risk assessment. What is the likelihood? What is the impact? Okay. Determine your information security risks as a combination of likelihood and impact of threat exploitation of vulnerabilities. So again, you can imagine if you're a technological organization or really just any kind of organization in general, that the multitude of threat actors and potential threat events that exist could be in the tens of thousands, really. I mean, realistically. So it's not really feasible to explore every possibility and to protect against every single possibility. So you need to prioritize your response. And that prioritization of response occurs based on likelihood and impact. It's a really, really important concept. We've seen it multiple times already throughout the lecture. Okay? Once you've gone through the assessment and you've achieved, you've achieved the results of the assessment, make sure that the decision makers have all of the relevant information to understand risk within the organization, because that will ultimately assist you and them in guiding the decisions that you make to mitigate the risk within the organization. And again, ultimately, it typically comes down to how much spend we get to be able to protect against risk or threats in our environment. We need to keep the knowledge of the risks current. The threatscape is constantly changing. I would almost argue on a daily basis. But, there are other events that can occur within the organization that changes the threatscape. You upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10. You add a second internet connection for redundancy to a different service provider. You create a new partner relationship with a new extranet partner that you have connectivity to. You change your vendor, your supply chain vendor. Anything, any kind of change within the organization would require additional maintenance to and really kind of a reevaluation of the risk to the organization. We need to monitor the risk factors identified in our initial assessment on an ongoing basis and understand changes to those particular factors because it will change our position. In other words, this process is never ending. It's constantly evolving. Update the components of the assessment reflecting monitoring activities. All right. So, risk assessments evaluate the following. We need to evaluate the threats to our assets and understand the vulnerabilities within our environment. All right. Just because, again, there's a threat doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be concerned. It's a threat in combination with vulnerabilities that result in risk to our organization. What is the likelihood that the threat is realized by taking advantage of a particular exposure? An exposure is a vulnerability to a particular threat. What is the impact that will have on the organization? What kind of countermeasures can I implement to reduce the threat's ability to exploit exposure? In other words, reduce my threatscape footprint, basically, to lessen the impact to the organization. Ultimately, there's always going to be residual risk left over. Residual risk is whatever is remaining after I've already applied all of my mitigation techniques, or I've enacted my particular risk management strategy. Okay? We can never reduce risk to zero, but we can reduce it to at least an acceptable level, right? At least some sort of a manageable, acceptable level, whether it's based on cost or whatever it might be, okay? All right, and we're going to get into the calculations, quantitative versus qualitative, and different models for assessing risk in an organization. All right. All right. So I'm going to go through these frameworks, these audit methodologies, if you will, well, I wouldn't say slowly. I want to make sure that we go through this in enough detail that it's going to be beneficial for you on the exam. First one we see here is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations for the Treadway Commission, called COSO. This was formed in 1985. It's a joint initiative to combat essentially corporate fraud. And it was established in the United States by different private sector organizations. And it was developed to basically guide executive management and government entities in different aspects of organizational governance. Things that include things like business ethics, internal control, business risk management, fraud and financial reporting, and so on. So it is a common, what we call a common internal control model, which companies can then use this model to evaluate their control systems. And there are different organizations within the United States that have kind of adopted this as a standard. Some of the key concepts of COSO, and then I'll move on to the next ITIL. But the COSO framework involves several kind of different key concepts. That internal control is a process. It is a means to an end, if you will. It's not the end itself. It is a process that you go through. Internal control is carried out by the individuals within the organization. It's not just simply about policies, about defining manuals and forms, but about the individuals within the organization as well. And the whole idea is that if you implement these internal controls, there is at least a little bit of expectation of reasonable security. not absolute security, because that's never going to be accomplishable, but reasonable security. And then obviously we have certainly defined objectives and in different categories and so on. All right. There are 5 essentially frame components to COSO. I'm not going to get into really the details of each of them, but the control environment is really just the definition of ethical values, integral values, operational style for the administration, any kind of delegation of authority systems that you have in place within the organization. The risk assessment component, of course, is how we determine risk within the organization. And the organization needs to have clear objectives defined in order to be able to identify and assess the risks within the organization based on those objectives. And we talked about that already kind of previously when we looked at the risk assessment framework from Nist. Then you have specific control activities, and these are activities that occur throughout the organization at all levels. It could be asset safety, operational performance reviews, approvals, verifications, all the stuff that we talked about previously, segregation of functions and so on. And then finally, information and communication. Well, actually, information and communication would be one. I guess monitoring would be another one, right? Formalized procedures. For information and communication, you want to have formalized procedures for reporting if something is not occurring as it's supposed to be. Customers, external parties, how do we communicate with them? How do we communicate with suppliers and regulators and shareholders, etc.? And then there's always going to be some sort of monitoring component. The monitoring component would be, obviously a way for us to monitor the effectiveness of the program and so on. All right, so that's one example. ITIL is another example, and the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. There are actually 2 different sets of detailed practices that are identified. The ITSM, which is IT Service Management, and ITAM, which is IT Asset Management, which focus on, processes and procedures and tasks, checklists or whatever, for, organizational strategy for delivering not only specific levels of operation, but a baseline for which you can operate, right? Now, ITIL has, it's not specific to risk analysis. There are specific components that discuss risk, but in general, it is just a way for us to govern IT assets within our organization. All right. COBIT. We'll see more about COBIT as we go through the lesson here, the control objectives for information and related technologies. Also a framework. It was created by ISACA. ISACA is the information, now I'm challenging myself. Information Systems Audit and Control Association, I believe. And they have the COBIT framework is a framework for, again, IT asset management and IT governance. Again, we're just basically defining processes for the management of IT within an organization. There are specific frameworks for IT governance, which define both IT governance objectives, best practices. We have different process descriptions. The process map includes things like planning and building and running and monitoring IT systems, different control objectives, management guidelines, and so on. We'll see more about COBIT a little bit later on. The COBIT version 5, as we can see here, is based on COBIT 4.1 and what we call Val IT 2.0 and other risk IT frameworks for defining, risk management within the organization. Well, I would say control objectives in this case, because that's what COBIT stands for, right? Control objectives for IT. Okay. We already talked about ISO in general, specifically 27001, but 27002 :13, 27, well, the colon 2013 just represents the latest version, I guess. But this is an information security standard as well. We'll cover this in a lot more detail later on. It has information security controls. There's 14 different areas that are covered and so on. One of the things that you will find throughout the rest of this domain and other domains, many different types of frameworks that exist. Excuse me. Now, I used to always say, you got to know the frameworks for the exam. You got to know the frameworks for the exam. And I have found that that's now really not necessary. They do ask about them on the test from time to time, but I don't think it's enough to dedicate, the storage in your brain for the exam. We will certainly talk about each of these different directives, but what they're mentioning here with regard to NIST Special Publication 830 Revision 1, 839, 866, these are all part of the NIST cybersecurity frameworks, the different specifications. And, kind of each of these kind of apply to different areas, right? We talked about specifically Special Publication 853, Federal Information Systems, and so on. As you can see here, 866 is directed for HIPAA, 839 is for general organizational risk management, 830 information systems risk management, and so on. So again, understanding each of these elements or understanding these in detail is probably not necessary. Will they ask you, about specifically 866? Probably not. They might ask you which NIST framework applies to information systems risk management, and unfortunately, that's just something that you would have to memorize. Okay. Ccta Risk Analysis and Management Method, another risk management methodology, currently on version 5. There's basically 3 stages with different objective questionnaires and guidelines. Stage 1 would be establishing the objectives for security. What is the boundary of the study for risk assessment? What are we valuing? What are our assets in the organization? What is the value of the data that's held by those assets? What are the potential business impacts that could arise from the unavailability of those assets, the destruction, the disclosure, the modification of those assets? How do we identify and value the software assets that are part of that system as well? That's step 1. That's stage 1, I should say. Asset identification and valuation. Stage 2, threat and vulnerability assessments, what we call the assessment of the risk. We need to identify and assess the type and level of threats that could affect the systems in our organization. assess the extent of the system's vulnerabilities to those identified threats. This is sounding very familiar to what we saw previously. And then combining the threats and the vulnerability assessments with the asset values to end up calculating what the measured risk is for the organization. I say this in every class. It's always kind of, all these frameworks are similar. It just depends on who's developing the framework. CRAM, in this case, was developed by NATO, specifically the Dutch, and they worked with Unisys and so on. There are English and Dutch versions of this, but it's going to be very similar to frameworks that were developed in other geographical regions like the United States. The third is countermeasure selection. Obviously, we need to select countermeasures to reduce risk. There's a predefined library in CRAM, over 3,000 or 4,000 different countermeasures that are detailed and organized based on different logical groupings, and we don't need to get into the details of each of those logical groupings. All right. Another framework, FRAP, the Facilitated Risk Analysis Process. Again, another technique to identify and assess risk factors within an organization. Now, in this case, it could be a little bit more specific, applying to a specific project or achieving a specific goal. But we need to be able to identify measures that we can put in place to reduce the probability of risk factors from occurring. What are those countermeasures? How can those countermeasures be used to successfully deal with the constraints within the project itself? We want to make sure that we're not implementing controls that prevent us from having the ability to achieve our goal, right? Too much security can be a hindrance as well. But FRAP is really kind of the facilitated risk analysis process is really kind of identified as an analysis process for an individual system or a single business process. And we would maybe perform multiple analyses depending on how many processes we are applying this to and so on. All right. So again, just another a framework. Octave, also another framework. The operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability evaluation. And again, it's going to have similarities to other frameworks, right? You'll see an aspect of analysis where we're trying to identify, the assets in the organization, and we're trying to evaluate the assets in the organization. This particular one was developed by the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon. 3 phases that are process driven. We need to identify, prioritize, and manage risks within the organization. So build asset-based threat profiles, and then based on that, identify the vulnerabilities of those assets, and then based on that, come up with our strategy for protecting those assets. So again, it's very, very similar to other, type of threat modeling and risk assessment processes that exist. All right. SOMAP. I don't know if these are called SOMAP or not. I just call it SOMAP because that's what it sounds like to me. But SOMAP, the Security Officers Management and Analysis Project, is another example open information security management project with free and open tools. What we call Utopia, user-friendly tools for operating informatics applications. That's, one example, but SOMAP is just a set of tools that we can use to understand risk within our organization, risk management, including both qualitative and quantitative approaches. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Spanning tree analysis, a way for us to create essentially a list of all the possibilities of a particular event, being able to identify the likelihood that something is going to occur, what are all the different iterations or potential iterations of that effect, and so on. And then value at risk. Now, value at risk is a way for us to measure the risk of loss for specific investments. And it's defined here as provides a summary of worst loss due to security breach over the target horizon. In essence, what does that mean? That means that we're going to estimate how much a set of investments we might lose. We're not talking about, valuation risk. We're not talking about, risking loss, because we invested in something incorrectly or whatnot. But we're talking about in regard to asset value, right? Now, it does say here that most of these tools are qualitative and not based on theory. All right, qualitative, a tool that is qualitative is a tool that is, well, actually, I'll describe the difference between qualitative and quantitative in a little bit, but let me just say that quantitative is a calculable value. We actually apply a formula to the calculation of risk, whereas qualitative is more subjective. It can be based on personal experience, professional experience, and so on. VAR is theoretically based on quantitative measures of security risk, and we'll get into the detail of that in a little bit. All right, we're actually going to break that down quite a bit. So here's a visual representation of the SOMAP risk assessment workflow. Really no different than the other assessment workflows that we talked about. We collect our data, which, by the way, includes identifying the assets in our organization, identifying the physical assets, the technological assets, and whatnot, performing our threat analysis. Who are our threat actors? What does our threatscape look like? Looking at our the vulnerability of the assets within our organization, identifying what level of risk is acceptable to the organization. And again, this is going to be primarily based on two values. What is the impact to the organization? What's the likelihood that an event's going to occur? And then finally applying the risk treatment to that process. And risk treatment, we'll talk about the different risk treatment techniques that we can apply later on in this section here. All right, the value at risk framework, very similar, only 4 steps. Identify the threats. Of course, we're still going to, at some point, need to be able to identify the assets in the organization. We can't identify the likelihood that an attack is going to occur unless we understand what the assets are in the organization. But we are going to certainly identify the assets in the organization, identify the threats against those assets, what's the likelihood that those threats are going to be realized, what is the value at risk, which is essentially the value of the asset or the exposure that we have based on impact, or probability of harm, I guess, and magnitude of impact. That would be the likelihood and the impact. And then apply our risk mitigation techniques based on those that criteria. All right. Now, fundamentally, there are two ways that we can assess risk, or at least quantify risk within our organization. We can do a qualitative risk assessment, or we can do a quantitative risk assessment. A qualitative risk assessment, is used by individuals that don't understand or don't have enough information to provide a quantitative assessment. Qualitative assessments tend to be a little bit more general. They're more based on experience and based on your estimated assumptions of what type of impact is going to occur. The implementation is typically a little bit simpler because you're not actually inputting numerical values or assessing true physical values of assets or monetary values of assets. But typically, any type of assessment that is qualitative is going to be based on your general assumptions and general experience. An example of this or a demonstration of this would be to say, okay, I understand that this email server is extremely important to the business. These are generally the threats that are associated to that email server. These are kind of generally the likelihood that those threats would be realized. And based on my experience, I've seen these types of attacks are very common. These types of attacks are not as common. And we kind of essentially just evaluate risk based on that. It's almost like saying, okay, the value of the items at my property, have this particular value. The likelihood that an earthquake is going to occur is relatively low. I've lived here since 1997, and I haven't felt or we haven't had an earthquake of any significance. So I'm going to make my decisions about the type of risk appetite I have based on that experience. All right. Now, a quantitative approach is significantly different. We'll get into the details of a quantitative approach on the next slide here. With regard to a qualitative approach, documents are necessary for the assessment, and they could include things like what is the strategy of your information security program? What are your policies, your guidelines, your baselines? What are the network diagrams, device configurations? What is your patch management strategy? How are you managing patches in the organization? What kind of documentation do you have that applies to software development, if you're doing software development in your organization, or just the software development lifecycle for software that you're actually utilizing in the organization? Do you have a business continuity plan in place, a disaster recovery plan in place? How do we handle incidents within the organization? You're certainly going to have to classify the data. You're going to have to understand, what type of input you're going to get from other experts or other department heads or managers in different parts of the organization. So I don't want to make it seem like a qualitative assessment is not thorough. They can be very, very thorough. They're just not broken down to a calculable value. They're not broken down to a formula that lets us estimate or not even really estimate, truly calculate an annualized lost expectancy based on an asset within the organization. And quite frankly, most assessments that occur in enterprises today are qualitative in nature. it's very rare that you're actually going through the process of assessing the value of assets within your organization down to a dollar value and going through the entire quantitative approach. We will certainly see that in a minute. All right. So its represented staff levels include the represented staff levels that participate in this qualitative approach include senior or line management, business unit owners, other staff. Risks are calculated with likelihood and impact, so we're still focusing on those two key elements. What is the likelihood? What is the impact producing that risk? And then what countermeasures are we going to apply to reduce that risk? Okay. A quantitative assessment is strictly calculated. Now, I will say that even though we apply formulas to our quantitative assessment approach, I would argue that even the quantitative approach has to include some sort of qualitative measure. I'll explain what I mean by that as we kind of go through this process here. But in the quantitative assessment, we are analytically analyzing risk within the organization based on the same values that we talked about in the quantitative approach. What is the probability? What is the impact? But there is a discrete mathematical formula that gets used to determine the cost of the risk so that we can ensure that the cost of the countermeasures don't outweigh the cost of the risk. Okay? So the first thing that you have to do is you have to determine something called the asset value. Asset value in dollars is the dollar value of the asset within the organization. Now, this might seem like a relatively simple thing to calculate. If it was a vehicle that you were driving every day, that could be relatively easy to calculate. You know what you paid for the car, you know what you paid for the upgrades to the car as soon as you got it, and you know what a depreciative value is for vehicles. But what if I said, what is the asset value of an exchange server in your organization? Do you say, okay, well, the server itself cost X amount of dollars? The hardware, the software, the licensing. That's certainly easy to quantify. But what about the cost of the data itself? Are we really concerned about just simply the cost of the server? How valuable is the information that's stored on that server? The emails, if we lose those emails, is there a value to that? The amount of time that it would take to recover that platform if we need to replace that platform. So it's not as cut and dry as it may seem. How do I define what the value of the asset is? Also, what is the exposure factor? Exposure factor, or EF, is the percent of loss if the perceived threat was realized. So again, how do you quantify that? 10%, 20%, 50%, 100%? It's a very challenging thing to quantify because you say, okay, well, if it's a distributed denial of service attack and the asset value is $100,000, what really truly is the exposure factor for denial of service? The asset itself is not really being compromised. We're not losing the functionality of the asset permanently. As soon as we figure out how to block the denial of service traffic, the asset should be functional again. So, would that be considered a 10% effective loss, 20% effective loss? I guess you would have to figure out that exposure factor based on how important that application is to your enterprise. And over time, what a percentage would be that would represent essentially that downtime, I guess. Does that make sense? So, that would be considered maybe an exposure factor. But again, it's not really a hard, fast number. It's not a XYZ type of number. Okay? But let's say that the asset value is $10,000 and the exposure factor is 50%. We've calculated it at 50%. That means that our single loss expectancy is $5,000, half of the value of the asset. Now, that's our single loss expectancy, which is a dollar value based on the asset value times the percentage of the exposure factor. So our single loss expectancy is $5,000. The next thing we have to do is we have to multiply that single loss expectancy against something called the annualized rate of occurrence. How many times per year do we expect this particular threat to be successful? And by the way, it doesn't have to be per year. It could be per every 2 years or per every 5 years or whatever. All right. So if it's one event every 2 years, the annualized rate of occurrence is 0.5, meaning half of an event every year, which means that we take that 0.5 times our single loss expectancy of $5,000. That gives us an annualized loss expectancy of $2,500. Does that make sense? So now we have an annualized rate of occurrence. We have our single loss expectancy. We have our annualized loss expectancy, $2,500. Now we start to consider what controls we want to put into place, what countermeasures we want to put into place. We have to consider, are those countermeasures 100% effective for this particular threat? Are they 90% effective? Would they reduce the exposure to, instead of if it's a distributed denial of service attack, instead of a downtime of 3 hours, we might have a downtime of 15 minutes. So I would maybe kind of calculate essentially my residual risk based on placing the mitigating elements in place. So we'll make it an easy number. $2,500 is our annualized loss expectancy. Putting in our countermeasures will reduce the exposure to by 50%. So instead of a 3-hour downtime, our countermeasures would put us down to a 1.5-hour downtime, which means in essence that we would be saving $1,250. And if our countermeasure tool costs $5,000, it doesn't make sense. We don't want the tools that we implement to reduce the risk to cost more than the risk itself. Now, that's if we're looking at this strictly from a numerical perspective. We're not looking at this from a regulatory perspective, or we're not looking at this from a reputational perspective. We're simply looking at this from a financial perspective. The countermeasures should be less than the mitigating risk. Now, I have, as an example, have done many, many different quantitative assessments. But in production, as a practical matter for a company, quantitative risk assessments can be very challenging because not only do you have to do this for one type of threat, but you potentially have to do this for all the different threats. And it could be hundreds or thousands of threats. So that's why qualitative tends to be used more often, because it makes more sense. You kind of generalize the threatscape for the appliance or the device or the application or the asset. You generalize the effect that an attack would have on the organization, and you generalize the cost, and then you implement countermeasures based on those generalizations, as opposed to, literally calculating a specific value for every potential threat that might exist. Does that make sense? So, not to say that quantitative assessments don't, have a place. I've always just kind of, said that there's always going to be some sort of qualitative a component to this, because we just can't assign a quantitative value to everything. Does that make sense? Of course, it is likely on the exam that they will give you a scenario where you have to calculate some sort of risk response based on a quantitative approach. How do we identify vulnerabilities in our systems? We can use different tools to identify vulnerabilities. If it's a technological asset, we can use kind of peer reviews to identify vulnerabilities in procedures or guidelines. Again, we're applying these concepts not only to physical assets or technical assets, but anything that we do within our organization. A vulnerability could be that we don't have a man trap or a vestibule in place at the front desk to prevent tailgating. That could be considered a vulnerability. Or we don't have a receptionist, and we simply have a sign-in sheet at the front desk that can't be verified or monitored by an individual because we don't have a person sitting at the front desk. Those could be identified as vulnerabilities. All right? Vulnerability is an inherent weakness in an information system, a security procedure, internal controls, or implementation that a threat source can exploit. Okay? Some identifiable threats may include the absence of a receptionist, the absence of a man trap, or other security mechanisms to enter a facility, neglecting the requiring users to sign an acknowledgement of responsibilities with the security and understanding policies, patching and configuration of servers or software. It's not well processed or not well documented. The point is, take off the IT hat and don't simply think from a software, hardware perspective what vulnerabilities might exist. You are considering every aspect of the organization. You're considering every aspect of the organization. The vulnerability assessments focus on technical aspects. The assessor must be able to translate technical findings to a non-technical audience. As a security practitioner, you have to be able to prioritize your findings and the assessment of potential impact so that the needs are more measured, and the prioritization of the findings has to be done by essentially a human being, a qualified individual that can analytically assess these complex scenarios that you're walking through and you're looking at to be able to identify the weaknesses within your organization. Very, very important concept. Now, they do say vulnerability assessments focus on technical aspects. Generally speaking, that's true. But again, it depends on what you're evaluating, right? Maybe you're evaluating supply chain for the lunchroom, and you're worried about somebody introducing spoiled or otherwise tainted food into the lunchroom with the hopes of giving many of the employees food poisoning so that essentially you're trying to effective denial of service attack against the staff and the availability of staff because they'll all be out sick with food poisoning. I mean, that is a legitimate, well, potentially could be a legitimate concern. Again, it really depends on what kind of organization it is, what the importance of that staff is to the organization, and so on. Now, in that regard, I would say that that's a little bit less technical if you're kind of inferring that technical means technology, but it is still a vulnerability, right? Maybe you've identified a weakness in the vetting process for the food vendors. Maybe it's just Mary down the hall picked this food vendor because her cousin works there. There was no vetting done at all. That could be a concern. Now, you might go to the CEO and say, or the CIO and say, this is a concern. You would, of course, have to justify that. Remember, it's not just about the impact. The impact could be significant. If you have 100 employees that are eating at the same time and they're all eating the same thing, then that could be a pretty significant impact. But you also have to measure the likelihood. You'd have to be able to demonstrate that there was a reason why somebody would want to do something like that in your organization. Okay? Identify the threats. A threat is a circumstance or an event to adversely impact organizational operations, operations to assets, individuals through information systems via unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, or modification of information, and denial of service. So again, I don't necessarily agree completely with the definition. They are specifically identifying a threat as anything that would affect information systems. Generally speaking, as an information security officer, yes, your primary focus is going to be on information systems, but threats could exist in many cases. For example, you might be doing a walk around with the building engineer, and you walk around to the back of the building where the generator is, which is a physical asset, but that generator provides power in the event that you lose power to the facility. And if that generator isn't providing power, then your technical assets are no longer usable. And you realize that the generator is not secured. The fuel port on the generator doesn't have a lock on it. So what would prevent somebody from coming by and pouring a contaminant into the fuel tank so that when the generator triggers and starts to run, that it fails, right? That is considered a threat. Is it a direct threat to information systems? Maybe not, but it could affect the function of those information systems in the event that there is a power failure and you need to use that generator. So I would identify that as a threat. And I would, of course, say, well, the mitigating control would be to add a lock, and maybe even add CCTV or closed circuit TV to be able to monitor the generator and so on. Okay. Threat sources could include the intent or the method targeted at intentional exploitation of vulnerable devices, or a situation or a method to trigger vulnerabilities accidentally. So threats don't always have to be intended. The threat actors don't necessarily always have to be bad people. It could just be somebody doing something accidentally, right? For example, having a rack in your data center plugged into the wall, and the power cord stretches across the floor and plugs into the wall, and somebody's walking by and accidentally trips over the power cord and unplugs the power to the rack because they tripped over the power cord. That is still considered a threat. Very easy to mitigate, protect the path for the power, run it where it's not going to be an obstruction to normal movement, etc. But again, that's doesn't necessarily have to be, some black hat hacker out on the internet trying to do something. Okay. Different threat source categories include human threats, could be malicious, outsider or insider. It could be a terrorist, competitive operative. It could be loss of personnel. I talked about food poisoning in the cafeteria. A pandemic is a perfect example. How many businesses were affected by the loss of employees? And then it became extremely difficult because of government policy to hire good employees because people wanted to stay at home and collect the government checks, right? And I'm not saying that was a good thing or a bad thing. I have my own personal opinion, but regardless, that was still a human threat that was exacerbated. Initially, it was the pandemic, and then that was exacerbated by policy. And businesses are still seeing the effect of that today, right? Could be human error. Somebody mistypes a command. Could be based on cultural issues. Oftentimes, a language is an issue. I'll give you an example of cultural issue that I thought was pretty interesting. I was building a call center in India, specifically in Calcutta, right? And it was for a company based out of California, but they were building out their own call center in India. And of course, being a call center, we had to have PSTN access, or public switch telephone network access. So there was supposed to be a PRI installed at the facility, which was physically installed, but it wasn't working. Long story short, we didn't have the same resources to troubleshoot and fix that circuit in India that we would have in the United States. You would call a AT&T or Verizon or whoever, give them the circuit ID, they would dispatch a technician, and they would do it with haste and most likely get that issue resolved relatively quickly. In India, we literally walked down the street to the telco, the service provider, into the building that was completely unlocked and open and practically abandoned, and into a room where two gentlemen were smoking and playing cards with a bunch of relay racks in the room. And after a lot of heated exchange between my counterpart and these gentlemen, we left, and they would not fix the problem unless we paid them $100. So a completely different type of culture, right? Completely different type of culture. And so the issue was not resolved for a couple of days. It could be a natural disaster, fire, flood, tornado, hurricane, earthquake. It could be something like a technical failure, a RAID controller fails, or a hard drive fails. Maybe there's some code that includes like a backdoor or some sort of keylogger or some malicious code. It could be the poor implementation of emerging technologies. I mean, there's many, many things that constitute technical threats. Could be a physical threat, a perimeter defense failure, a closed circuit TV failure, false alarms. There's an interesting story about a heist that took place in Los Angeles, an art heist. And I wouldn't necessarily say that this was a physical failure. I would say more of a human failure. But the thieves climbed up on the roof of this art facility. They cut a hole in the roof, and they put their equipment or whatever in the building, and it set off the alarm. Okay, no problem. They take their equipment out. They lay up on the roof. They wait on the roof. The police come by. They look at the window. They look at the doors. Everything seems to be kind of in order, right? Doesn't appear as though anybody has broken into the facility. So they think it's a false alarm and they leave. And then 10 minutes, 20 minutes later, they set the alarm off again. The police show up again. The owner of the facility shows up again. And again, this is at 2 in the morning or whatever. This is a true story, by the way. And the police are like, well, okay, nothing. We don't see anything. Okay. And then I think that happened a couple more times. And of course, you also understand that now this business is paying for each of these responses because the security company is there and everybody else. So eventually they just kind of assume or determine that there's an issue with the alarm system and it needs to be fixed. So the owner disables the alarm system and says, well, we'll just call the alarm company tomorrow during normal business hours. Well, then without the alarm system, the thieves were able to get into the facility. They stole tens of millions of dollars worth of art and were never caught, at least not at that time. I wouldn't necessarily say that is a technological failure, but it was a failure in policy or failure in procedure, right? Go into the facility, check around, look, check the roof, whatever. Can you plan for stuff like that? Not necessarily all the time. Oftentimes a lot of different types of attacks that happen on technology or on physical assets or on people are things that you would never expect to happen, like the planes flying into the towers. That was the first time that any terrorist had intentionally crashed an airplane, and that was their goal from the beginning, right? It was always, oh yeah, they're going to have demands and they'll land and we'll try to meet their demands or we'll resolve the situation that way. The people on the planes weren't inclined to do anything. They thought, well, if we just kind of don't say anything or don't do anything, we'll eventually land and we'll be let go. So, it happens that way a lot, unfortunately. Environmental threats, hazardous waste, some sort of chemical or biological agent, a utility failure. I was talking about the generator previously. Operational threats, a process affecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability, meaning that you have a process in place that exposes information or exposes valuable assets because of the way that you're performing the operation. It could be how you're storing data. It could be how data is being transferred, how it's being utilized, etc. That makes sense? All right. And of course, there are literally hundreds of potential threats that could exist. Thousands, I would argue, actually, of potential threats that could exist. So risk analysis and the assessment of risk is taking a look at essentially four things. What are the threats to the organization? What is the threatscape? What are the vulnerabilities that exist within the organization? What is the likelihood that the threat is going to occur or the attack or exploit is going to occur? And what is the potential impact, right? Likelihood, again, not something that's generally quantitative. You say, well, you can base likelihood on industry standards or captured industry information. You can base likelihood on historical data. How often has this happened in the past? We would probably try to guess, at least educationally guess, what the likelihood of an event is. We create some sort of ordinal scale with high likelihood, medium likelihood, low likelihood. And then we calculate, we saw this in the BIA example previously, some sort of ordinal scale that's mapped to a numerical value for the computation of risk to the organization. And that's what allows us to prioritize the assets within the organization based on the risk and the value. Impact ranking can also be scaled. And impact could include loss of life. Of course, financial impact is always a concern. Reputation or prestige, market share, or anything else that you want to define that's important to your organization. Okay. So here's an example where we have the likelihood is, well, they have 5 different categories here. Very low, unlikely, moderate, likely, and almost certain. And again, this is just an example. It really depends on how specific you want to be. You could have 10 levels of likelihood, or you could have 3 levels of likelihood. All right. I mean, you could be even really generic and say likely or not likely, and simply classify it that way. Consequence: no impact or little impact, minor impact, some loss of confidence, moderate impact, the business is interrupted and there is loss of confidence, major impact, business is highly disrupted and a major loss of confidence, and catastrophic, the business cannot continue, right? I think that happened on 9/11 with an investment company. I think most or all of the employees of that investment company were in the towers, and when they were killed, the company just didn't exist anymore. There just wasn't anybody left, if I'm recalling that correctly. But again, this ordinal scale that you create really is dependent upon what you want to do for your organization. How do we qualify likelihood? Likelihood can be qualified in a couple of different ways. I tend to think of likelihood based on, how big is the target on your back type of thing. If you're an important public-facing entity with lots of revenue or lots of attention, lots of press, everybody knows who you are, I would say that you're more likely to be an attack vector than a small mom and pop donut shop on the corner of Main Street, right? But here they're kind of classifying likelihood based on the amount of skills that are necessary to be able to accomplish the attack. So if it's a high level of skill that's required, that's a low likelihood, very difficult to do versus very simple to do, high incentive versus low incentive. So they have different ways of kind of classifying likelihood. I tend to look at incentive as a primary one because, if you're trying to exfiltrate funds, dollars, you would probably attack a billionaire as opposed to attacking, some elderly person on Social Security. All right. But, the elderly person on Social Security is probably very simple to access and control as opposed to somebody with a lot of resources, with a lot of people consulting with that person and offering them advice. So it is kind of a balance. All right. So the rating, if it's a high skill, we give it a 1. If it's no skill, we give it a 5. Very difficult, a 1. Very simple, a 5. Obviously, the higher the number, the higher the risk. So a 1 is an E, a 2 is a D, a 3 is a C, a 4 is a B, and a 5 is an A. Because we do have 4 different categories here, we're going to add up the number from each and divide by 4, and that will put us on our scale there. All right. And then that's where we can kind of map it over to this likelihood chart here. All right. And again, just an example. This is not how you have to do it in your organization. This is just an example. Risk assessment and analysis. How do we determine risk? Risk is a byproduct of likelihood and impact. Okay? Now, that's not how we necessarily calculate risk. That's how we determine the level of risk. But we calculate risk based on the threatscape that exists and the threat actors and threat vectors, the exploits, if you will, and the vulnerabilities in our assets. And if those vulnerabilities match up with the particular threats, then that will lead to risk. But the determination of the risk value itself is primarily based on the likelihood and impact. So I want to be clear about that because this slide is not necessarily clear. The risk value is a byproduct of likelihood and impact. All right? But the actual existence of risk is more based on the threatscape and vulnerabilities in our systems. An exploit with a likelihood of 1 and an impact of 100 has a high risk of 100, and that would require immediate attention. Once you do your risk calculations, then you prioritize based on your risk appetite. You know, what risks do you want to mitigate and what risks do you want to maintain or, kind of ignore or avoid altogether and so on. So if a risk is almost, or the likelihood is almost certain, but the consequence is insignificant, we might classify that as high risk. And I actually probably wouldn't even go that far. But, certainly if something is almost certain, you want to address it. If it's likely but insignificant, we'll give that a moderate level. If it's possible or rare, insignificant, low level, and so on. So again, another way of kind of visually representing the risks within our organization, or at least quantifying those risks based on this scale. You would still have to have the input values, right? You'd have to determine likelihood somehow. And again, that's most likely going to be qualitative. You'd have to determine the consequence somehow, which could be quantitative, or it could be qualitative, or it could be a combination of both quantitative assessments and qualitative assessments. All right. What are the risk techniques? How about risk avoidance? By definition, risk avoidance is identifying the risk and then simply removing the risk completely, but by not implementing the technology. So if somebody says Windows 11 has a massive vulnerability, risk avoidance technique would be to say, well, we're not going to upgrade to Windows 11. Okay? Risk transfer, passing the risk to another entity. Okay? Risk transfer, this is a challenge, right? Because if you say, I don't have anybody in my organization that can effectively manage an email system. We have people that can set it up and get it operational, and we can run our email in-house, but I don't feel confident that the email administrator or the server administrator really knows how to manage that email system, particularly from a security standpoint. So I would say, well, that would be an unacceptable level of risk in the organization. So instead of doing that, we're going to go ahead and subscribe to Office 365. Now, some people might call that transferring the risk because you're transferring the risk to Microsoft. But it depends on how you look at it. if you're considering the risk of the server platform, the server operating system, securing the actual functional software, yes, that could be transferring the risk. If you're considering the issues of email attachments containing viruses and spam and everything else, maybe you're not transferring the risk because people still get their emails. Now, if you supplement the Office 365 service with security features, the spam filters and antivirus and so on, yes, you potentially could say that you're transferring the risk. The most common definition of risk transfer is insurance, car insurance or fire insurance, earthquake insurance, whatever it might be. You're not reducing the likelihood that an accident would occur. Just because you buy insurance doesn't mean that you're reducing the likelihood that you'll be in an accident. You're buying insurance to reduce the impact to you as an individual, financially, legally. The insurance company can represent you in court. They have their own legal team, etc. So, you have to consider transfer is a tough one, right? Because, some might say, well, that's not really risk transfer. The risk is still there. It's just, somebody else is responsible for it. So by definition, that would be what transfer is. I'm just saying it's kind of a gray area. All right. And again, not all risk can be transferred. Reputation, definitely not. If somebody in your employ, sends out nasty emails to a bunch of clients claiming that the business is a bunch of cheaters and they're stealing money from their clients, etc., regardless of whether or not you're running Office 365, or whatever, it still didn't affect, that still didn't affect the reputation. All right. Risk mitigation. 99% of the time, this is what we're trying to apply to risk within the enterprise to reduce our risk footprint. Risk mitigation means implementing controls, physical controls, administrative, technical controls, and so on, to reduce our risk footprint. We don't get it to zero, but we put countermeasures in place to help reduce either the impact or the likelihood. And then we have acceptance, risk acceptance. We might decide that we need these systems in place, so we're and the likelihood and impact is low enough that we're just going to accept that risk because the cost of mitigation is too high, or there isn't any possibility of mitigation based on, it's a legacy system or whatnot. I mean, there's always something you can do to mitigate. It's just a matter of whether or not it is viable, right, to do the mitigation. You may just simply accept the risk because the likelihood and impact are so low. All right. And then, of course, we need to assign the risk to an individual or to a group because they're going to have to ultimately manage that risk. So we have to identify the owner of the risk. All right. What kind of countermeasures can I put into place? A countermeasure is anything that I put into place to help mitigate risk. And of course, countermeasures are very critical to managing risk in our enterprise. There has to be accountability to the countermeasure, auditability, and the countermeasure has to be trusted. We don't want to introduce a countermeasure into an environment that inherently introduces its own kind of risk into that environment. The countermeasure has to be independent from other countermeasures. It doesn't have to rely on other countermeasures to be effective. Now, there are controls called compensating controls. We'll talk about what a compensating control is a little bit later on. They're not necessarily dependent on one another. They're more like secondary controls if a primary control fails. The countermeasures have to be consistently applied. They have to be cost effective and they have to be reliable. They have to be easy to use and sustainable. Again, when it comes to security, if something is complex and difficult to implement, most likely it's either going to be implemented incorrectly or not be implemented consistently or at all. All right? It has to be secure. It has to protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In other words, putting in a countermeasure to fix A should not create vulnerability B, which could fall under the CIA triad. It cannot create any additional issues with operation, and if there are issues, it can be reverted, and it should not leave any residual data from its function, meaning that it should be kind of a silent operator, if you will. Remediation activities need to be done by a qualified person. We need to identify risks within the area of the enterprise and deploy the countermeasures specific to those risks. That means that we have to have risk inventory, which is essentially all of that stuff we talked about previously in the form of assessing risk within the enterprise. And we need to make sure, especially if it's a technical control, that we maintain strong version control and we maintain strong change control visibility or functionality. All right. As far as implementation of countermeasures go, we need to identify the potential frameworks to use before implementing the controls. I don't know that this is all that critical. I would say that, obviously you're going to pick a framework that's either dictated by legislation or regulatory compliance, but ultimately you're going to choose a framework that fits your business model. If you're in the financial sector, choose a framework that's relevant to the financial industry. If you're in manufacturing, choose a framework that's relevant to manufacturing, and so on. But ultimately, most of these frameworks have very, very similar and common elements. So you should be pretty well protected regardless of the framework you choose. Questions are posed, the questions that should be posed by you, the security practitioner. What business issues do I need to consider? Who are the stakeholders and the end users? Am I addressing one area of business or multiple areas of business? How will I integrate the controls in the overall architecture? Where will the single point of failures be in this architecture? What tools should I use to set up the controls? And what metrics and measurements are we going to use to verify the validity of those controls in place? Okay. Evaluate what you're directly responsible for. Coordinate for the rest. Use the subject matter experts, the division chiefs, the managers, etc., for the other areas. Then we implement the countermeasures, but we have to make sure that the countermeasures don't reduce productivity. That's a difficult thing sometimes to achieve. Oftentimes, adding additional security makes things a little bit more difficult in the end. Okay? What are the different types of controls? There are directive controls, controls to specify rules of behavior. An example of a directive control would be an acceptable use policy or an employee handbook, right? AUP, using the internet, we expect you to behave this way. Using these applications, we expect you to behave this way. and so on. So directive controls are often referred to as what we call administrative controls. They encourage behavior, but they don't guarantee it. And the encouragement is done through some sort of penal system, right? Punitive recourse or punitive action taken based on the fact that you didn't follow the rules. A deterrent is a control that discourages security violations. Perfect example of a deterrent would be signage, right? Signs like armed guards or armed security, beware of the dog, you are being recorded, live recording in progress. How often do we see the stickers on the door that says emergency alarm will sound if you open this door, and then somebody opens the door and the alarm doesn't go off? Deterrents also don't guarantee a response. They encourage a response, but they don't guarantee a response. And deterrents are typically, I wouldn't say they're all necessarily administrative. For the most part, they're administrative. But an example of a technical deterrent would be a message that pops up on the screen when you access a secure system. This is a DoD system. Your actions are being monitored. Please log out immediately unless you're authorized, kind of thing. That would be a deterrent. All right. Preventative control. These are active controls. They can be technical. They can be physical. They can be logical. Logical and technical are kind of the same. They could be administrative. But a preventative control is, a firewall, an access control list, a lock on a door, that automatically locks or something like that. Okay? Compensating controls. Controls to substitute for the loss of the primary control. Remember, controls are supposed to operate independently, but that doesn't mean you cannot have redundant controls. So if a primary control fails, a compensating control can take over. Detective controls. Kind of like, I was going to say it's kind of like a deterrent, but not really, right? If you put in a CCTV system, a CCTV camera system, you might call that a detective control because you're monitoring video monitors and looking and watching and trying to identify bad things. But what if it's an unmonitored CCTV system? If they said, I'm installing a CCTV system, but it's not really being monitored. To me, that's more of a deterrent control as opposed to detective. There's nothing wrong with that. People put up dummy cameras all the time or dummy domes and whatnot. And, somebody walks into, it's interesting because I will, as I started teaching this class more and more, I started looking at in retail areas what kind of security mechanisms they have in place for to prevent retail theft. And you guys will see this. If you go into any Home Depot, they will have camera domes everywhere in the whole facility. But if you look at the top of the camera dome where it attaches to the ceiling, there is a loop, a wire loop that comes out of that housing, but the wire loop doesn't go anywhere. It's literally just a wire loop. They basically installed the domes, but didn't install anything inside the domes. And I just thought that was interesting. That they're there, but they don't actually do anything. Now that's not to say they don't have other security measures in place. I was at a Home Depot recently, and I saw, it was very easy to recognize them. The secret shoppers that are walking around, they're not actually shoppers. They're loss prevention folks and in plain clothes just walking around like they're shoppers, but they never have anything in their shopping cart. And even after 20 or 30 minutes, they're their shopping cart is still empty. You can always recognize them. Anyway, those would be detective controls as well. Not deterrent because they're secret, but detective. Corrective control, controls to remedy circumstances, mitigate damage, or restore controls. You probably wouldn't see these as much. Some people would classify backups as a corrective control. I would classify a backup as a recovery control. Controls to restore conditions to normal operations. To me, a corrective control is something that is somewhat automated. So, for example, having redundant firewalls, if one firewall is compromised and that firewall goes down, another firewall takes over the security functions of the network perimeter, that to me would be a corrective control. It's somewhat automated. Whereas recovery, an incident has occurred, we've documented the incident, now we're going through the manual process of recovering from that event. Now, that being said, there's an argument that redundant failover systems could be recovery as well. It just takes less time to get back to normal operations. But to me, recovery would be not that we're failing over, but that we're back to where we would be before the failure. 2 operational firewalls operating in an active and standby mode. That would be recovery to me. All right. So what we're looking at here is just a representation, a visual representation of controls relative to a response timeline. We can see that we have a planning phase. We have establishment phase for the defenses that we're implementing. Hopefully that occurs before an incident. But once the incident occurs, we have discovery and reaction elements and adjust and regroup elements as well. So directive controls, preventative controls, compensating controls typically get implemented prior to the incident occurring. A detective control, while it gets implemented prior to the incident occurring, obviously the whole point of a detective control is to detect that the incident actually occurred. So that control gets enacted. Corrective controls would be anything that gets put into place to fix the problem, and then recovery controls as well, adjust and regroup. So it gives us an idea of when these controls get kind of put into place, when they get enacted, and so on. All right. The directive controls, these provide guidance to expected behavior for security within the organization. Right? We talked about this, an acceptable use policy, employee handbook, any kind of documented procedure or policy or guideline that is presented to individuals so that they will follow those recommendations, and hopefully in following those recommendations will prevent some sort of incident from occurring. Deterrent controls are controls that maybe don't have any really true effect. A signage, for example, warning signs or warning banners, but they reduce potentially the exposure to a threat by encouraging individuals not to proceed with whatever type of attack they're planning, right? Having signs on the door that say, armed response, or beware of the dog, or closed circuit TV, you're being monitored, etc. Deterrent controls can also come in the form of documented punitive action that could take place. Mandatory minimum sentences, for example, for criminal activity are implemented as deterrents. To suggest that, hey, if you commit this crime, then you're going to get a minimum of 5 years. Hopefully that will act as a deterrent. All right, that places the power of action with to the user, and the user gets to decide whether or not they're going to continue with whatever it is they're planning based on the deterrent. Preventative control, like I said, these are the controls that we actually put into place. They have the ability to take action directly. A firewall is an example, a lock on a door, a fence, 10-foot tall fence with razor wire on top would be both a deterrent and a preventative control. Cameras, security cameras, that type of thing, not preventative controls. They are deterrent and detective controls, but are not necessarily proactively preventative, right? Because somebody could simply ignore that the cameras exist and continue to do what it is that they want to do. A compensating control, used when the existing controls cannot support an existing policy. All right? And other technology or processes that are implemented to supplement the existing environment. It could be short-term, could be long-term, but the idea of a compensating control is that it's not necessarily reliant on other controls, nor does it provide secondary reliance for primary controls. It is a backup control. All right. If a primary control fails, the compensating control can assist us in ensuring at least some level of risk mitigation or risk management. A detective control provides notification, closed circuit TV, an alarm system, a security guard. Although security guards could be classified as both preventative and detective, right? Because security guards can actually take action. But if you see a security guard walking around a facility, you might be less inclined to try to break into that facility because you know that they have a security in place. So that could be not only a deterrent, but also that security guard is actively monitoring the scene and can take action based on identifying a threat in real time. So some of these controls can kind of be classified into multiple categories. Just think about what the overall result is of that particular control, and that will give you an idea of its usefulness. Corrective controls are used when security incidents occur that require some sort of corrective action. So a security incident signals the failure of a detective, deterrent, preventative, or compensating control. So a quick fix change could include modifying firewall rules. If you're noticing that a denial of service attack is occurring and that denial of service attack is coming from a specific set of IP addresses, you might implement a temporary filter in the firewall to block that range of IP addresses. Access control policy changes, temporarily locking a door, for example. If somebody states that there is a possible intruder in the building or an active shooter, what do? You can lock down the building. That would be considered somewhat of a corrective control, but again, that also could be considered preventative. It really just depends on how you view it. But you get the idea of how this should look when you are when you're evaluating these different types of controls. Recovery controls are compensating controls that are used to accurately reinstate services. But the key here is normal operations, not active operations, because failing over to a secondary firewall would not be considered a recovery control because you're still not operating under normal conditions. That would be a corrective control. You're restoring operations, but not under normal conditions. All right. Another way to classify access controls is with their method of implementation. And you will most likely see something like this on the exam. An administrative control. For me, I would say that anything that is a policy, a procedure, or a guideline would be considered an administrative control. Now, putting a sign, up, on a building saying armed security response or alarm system installed. Some people might classify that as an administrative control, but I would classify that as a physical control. It is a physical piece of property that you're installing. Now, it's not preventative. It is a deterrent, but it still qualifies as a physical control. So administrative controls to me are controls that define policies, procedures, and guidelines. Job roles, job functions, department functions, change control board functions, anything that defines how something operates or how something should operate would be an administrative control. Logical, often referred to as technical controls, are what we would typically think of as IT administrators as your typical type of control that you would implement to control electronic assets. Putting in firewalls, anti-malware, antivirus, IDS, IPS, mandatory access control mechanisms, authentication, authorization, and accounting systems, etc. Anything that involves the use of technology would be considered a logical control. Or, as I said, some people might call it a technical control. Physical controls are walls, gates, locks, buildings, bollards, anything that protects physical property. All right? Now, they do say locks, gates, and guards, right? But it could be fences, it could be signage, it could be dummy security cameras. CCTV is often kind of identified because it is technology as a logical control, but it also kind of falls under the physical category because it monitors the physical perimeter and it visually allows us to visually monitor the physical perimeter or whatever the camera is pointed at, basically. So there are some areas where controls might fall into multiple categories. As an example, a biometric lock, a palm vein scanner or a hand geometry scanner in front of a data center door. Now, technically, locks are classified as physical controls, but a palm vein scanner or a hand geometry scanner is going to require some sort of back-end database, some sort of software recognition, image recognition, data point recognition, and so on. So from that perspective, it really is kind of a technical control as opposed to a physical control. So whether or not the controls are classified in one category or the other are not really, truly that critical. Just understand that if you see references to these controls on the exam, that you kind of understand what the difference of the three categories are. Okay? So, some examples. An administrative directive would be like an acceptable use policy or any kind of documented policy within the organization. Administrative deterrent would be a policy, but a policy that defines punitive action. Being suspended for 3 weeks or being written up or being terminated because of a violation. That would be the deterrent factor of the policy. The policy itself is not the deterrent. It's whatever documented punitive damages, or punitive recourse would take place based on the absence or lack of due care with that policy. All right? An administrative preventative control a user registration procedure, so onboarding and offboarding of employees. There's a specific set of checkboxes that have to be checked to ensure that employees are onboarded and offboarded effectively. An administrative detective control, violation reports, employee reviews, etc. Corrective controls could be termination, as an example. Administrative recovery could be a disaster recovery plan. Administrative compensating, job rotation, logs, supervision of individuals, and so on. Meaning that somebody has been written up multiple times in a violation report for not effectively operating the forklift in the warehouse. So the next time that individual goes and operates the forklift, the supervisor is there to monitor and hopefully provide feedback based on what that individual is doing correctly or incorrectly. Technical directive, configuration standards, right? What we call baseline standards. If you're going to implement this server, it needs to be patched to this level. It needs to have this software installed. It has to have this physical redundant hardware, etc. It's not the actual implementation, but it's the documented process, the directive, so to speak. A deterrent, a technical deterrent, a warning banner. That would be like a login banner or a notification banner that pops up. That's probably the most common example. I'm trying to think of another technical deterrent. I suppose I was going to say a camera system. Maybe facial recognition. Somebody accessing a secure area. The fact that that it's there, but that's kind of borderline, right? Between physical and technical. A technical preventative control, multi-factor authentication. There's hundreds and hundreds of examples of technical preventative controls. An IPS, intrusion prevention system, anti-malware installed on a computer, rule-based access control mechanisms in place, with GPOs and Active Directory domain restrictions and so on. Technical detective controls, SIEM, logs, log correlation, page notifications, anything that's going to identify that an event has occurred, but it uses some sort of computing response, is going to be a technical detective control. Technical corrective, shut down a port, right? You're running network access control with Xero Trust boundaries. Somebody doesn't meet compliance standards, you shut down the port. Port security, unplugging a station, if it's infected, isolating it from the network. Technical recovery controls, backups is a perfect example. I would also say that redundant systems would fall under this category as well, although they could, I actually would put them under corrective. Because remember, recovery by definition is back to normal operation. So if you have a firewall pair or a server pair operating in redundant fashion, the primary server fails and the backup server takes over, you're still not operating in normal mode. You're not operating in a normal function, right? You are operating and you're functional, but you're not operating in a normal mode. So that would be, to me, a corrective control. All right. The recovery would be to get the primary server back up and running so that we're operating in normal operations again. Compensating technical controls, CCTV. I'm trying to think of how that would qualify as a compensating control. I guess, you know, you might identify that somebody has accessed a secure area using a badge, and we got a notification that the authentication occurred, and then we can use the CCTV to verify who that individual is. Or if some event occurs, we can use that CCTV to you know, go back and look at that event. But that's a tough one, right? Physical directives, signage, right? Traffic lights, a red light, green light, that's a perfect example of a directive. Red light means stop, green light means go, yellow light means proceed with caution or yield. Authorized personnel, you know, authorized personnel only, no trespassing, those are directives. No solicitation, those are directives. Physical deterrent would be something that would potentially instruct an individual that there could be some sort of recourse or some sort of response action, like beware of the dog or armed guard response or police response. That would be a deterrent. A physical preventative control would be locks on a door, a fence, barriers, gates, stuff like that. A detective control would be a closed circuit television or security guards, alarm systems, that kind of thing, motion detection systems, and so on. A corrective control could be a fire extinguisher, you know, doors that automatically lock once a breach has occurred, an exterior breach has occurred. You know, I think of a castle as an example. You know, you have the moat, you have the drawbridge, and you know, you have the guys, the hairy guys with the big hot oil on the inside. So corrective control would be somebody crossed the drawbridge and made it to the main gate, but now they're getting hot oil dumped on them. That would be the corrective action, I suppose, in that case. Physical compensating controls, layered defense. What I was just describing, basically, is the idea of you know, layered defense. Okay, or what we call defense in depth. Physical controls, a broad spectrum of controls to protect physical assets. These are also referred to as operational controls in some frameworks. That can be a little bit confusing because to me operational would be more administrative. It includes doors, locks, windows, environmental controls, construction standards, and guards. Imagine concentric circles of security. With increased security, the closer you get to the valuable assets. That is a concept that we will see later on called defense in depth. Defense in depth, meaning that we have multiple layers of security. We want to protect assets and personnel working in areas. We want to, you know, have perimeter security. We want to have physical controls that balance the function of the building and security. We don't, and we'll talk about this in, I believe it's domain 7, if I'm not mistaken. It's either domain 6 or domain 7. I can't recall off the top of my head, but we will talk about, you know, security and architecture. You know, designing buildings with security in mind, with natural barriers, you know, the roadway construction, etc. We don't want buildings to look like prisons. We want people to feel comfortable, but they also want to feel safe. So we're not just going to, you know, put out these physical controls with physical protection as the only thing that's being considered. All right. Oversight of physical controls, we use the same principles as any other control. Least privilege with separation of duty. All right. With regard to physical entry controls ensure only unauthorized, authorized access. Turnstiles, an example for military installations, having an S-curve in the entry roadway with barriers, having also temporary or motion-activated barriers or security-activated barriers to block access. Obviously those are examples. Visitors should also be cleared and supervised. That doesn't necessarily fall under the category of physical control. Generating logs and having a policy that identifies how visitors are supposed to access the facility, but oftentimes it does include physical entry control mechanisms. Having a man trap to prevent tailgating, having a physical badge with a very visible color code to identify that the visitor is a visitor. Typically visitor badges have a very large V on them, or they're brightly colored, they're red or orange, to indicate that that person is a visitor. So badges, smart cards, swipe cards would be included. And yes, they do need their stinking badges because that's how we identify what level of access those individuals have. Access rights and privileges should be reviewed and audited and include random checks. I saw a question on the CISSP exam recently about badges and visitors, and it was talking about the responsibility, whose responsibility or how do we essentially maintain control of visitors entering the facility. And the choices were, there's a log sheet, we provide a badge for the visitor, and all of the answers kind of applied to standard operating procedures for visitors. But it was critical that it was a question about, reviewing access at a later date. So it was more related to, actively logging the visitors that were accessing the facility. But you get the idea, right? It's a whole bunch of things. What are administrative controls? These are policies, procedures, processes, guidelines, etc. So policies and procedures, personnel security, evaluation and clearances, security policies, monitoring. Now, I would say the monitoring piece is limited in this particular scenario because certainly log monitoring and whatnot is different than monitoring, employee access or employee activities. User management, privilege management. Also, we may use technical means to limit access to different systems, but the policies get put into place stating that you don't get a global domain admin account. You get a limited admin account based on your job role or your job function. The actual implementation of that would be more technical, but the policy defines how that technology should be implemented. Well, or at least what technology is required to meet the goals of the policy. All right. And obviously we're going to spend quite a bit of time kind of diving into this. There's a whole nother domain that kind of revisits a lot of these concepts. You have to have operations management control. That includes the alignment with the overall architecture. You need to understand vulnerabilities in your organization. You have to have a patch management strategy. And again, these are not the implementation of these policies, but the definition of these policies. That's the administrative control function. We're defining our patch management process. We're defining our vulnerability management process. We define how product life cycles are managed. How do we manage the network? Now, the actual implementation of that management is most likely going to be technical, but the policies are going to be administrative. Changes to the environment have to be defined, approved, tested, applied, verified, deployed, audited, and documented. This is what we typically would refer to as a change control, well, technically a change control process, but the change control process is managed and maintained by the change control board. We can't just have people running around making changes to the enterprise ad hoc or independently without some peer review, because ultimately that may introduce additional security risks within the organization, additional vulnerabilities within the organization. Business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans ensure critical operations. All right. And we'll talk more about that in detail. The security architect, the security practitioner, or the security professional incorporates security measurements into these plans, being able to verify the effectiveness of the programs. Ensure that network administrators, systems owners, and application developers understand the security control environment. Very important concept. All right. All right, from a personnel security and evaluation and clearance perspective, it states that this is the most overlooked aspect of control. Personal security, evaluations, and clearances. I guess it depends on what type of business you're in. On the private or the public sector side, this is probably one of the primary areas of focus. But in the private sector, maybe not as much, right? You probably don't see as much of these types of evaluations. But you need to base, access to systems, access to resources based on the level of sensitivity of the data, and you would take appropriate vetting actions or verification actions for that individual based on that. It may be based on regulation. It may be based on the contract that you have with a business partner. It could be just defined as an industry standard, would define how that individual is screened, right? For example, if you're a private school and you want to hire a school bus driver, there is an industry standard for vetting that school bus driver. You may not fall under the regulatory guidance that's required for, say, a public school or state-sponsored school, but you would probably follow the same procedures, right? But personal security, evaluation, clearances based on background checks, interviews, credit checks, employment history, polygraphs, and so on. We talked about this previously. We have to try to determine the person's propensity for unlawful acts. Whether it's through voluntary action, the individual just has a propensity to commit crime for personal gain, or whether it's through potential coercion, because somebody has a gambling problem, they need money, they don't have money, so they get paid money for quid pro quo, for access to sensitive information, etc. And this should be done on a periodic basis. Obviously, you want to make sure that you have non-disclosure and confidentiality agreements as well. And it says those should be read and signed annually. That's a general industry practice. I don't know if it's legally necessary, but certainly if the policies change, those would have to be read and re-verified and re-signed. Also non-compete agreements, etc. Anything that you wish to implement legally to protect your enterprise and your intellectual property. Security policies, access policies, an example, should contain statements of security principles. and how those security principles apply to the business. Security requirements for the enterprise applications, the systems, the services that run within the enterprise. There has to be consistency between access control and information classification policies. We talked about this quite a bit in our risk assessment section. If you are evaluating systems for access control purposes, you need to be able to classify those systems appropriately. A misclassification of a system could result in misuse of information, whether intentionally or non-intentionally. So it's very, very important that we identify assets in the organization, we classify those assets appropriately, and then we apply protection mechanisms based on that classification. Contractual obligations or regulation compliance for the protection of the assets could drive our security policy as well. Standards for the industry that we're in, etc. We talked about all of this previously as well. Monitoring is always going to be a component of any security policy. We need to make sure that whatever it is that we're doing is effective. So monitoring is essential not only to administrative controls, but every other type of control that we might implement. We have to monitor the activity. We need to make sure that controls cannot be disabled. The logs can be important for criminal prosecution or just lessons learned, being able to identify what's occurring within the enterprise. We need to be able to identify individuals. If we have just one global domain admin account that all the administrators use, it would be very difficult to associate some criminal activity to an individual person. So we have to have a way of uniquely identifying individuals within that are accessing systems, whether it be based on a timestamp, a MAC address, a user ID, a badge, a common access card, or whatever it might be. Okay. We also need to make sure that those logs are retained for an adequate amount of time. And we need to, and this is very critical, we need to ensure the integrity of those logs. A lot of people, they'll do logs, they'll capture logs, and there's two common mistakes that they'll make about these logs. Number one, the logs won't have the appropriate timestamp because they don't enforce some sort of time technology in their network. And logs that don't have an appropriate timestamp, it makes it difficult to correlate events. It makes it difficult to identify when a particular event occurs. It also makes it difficult to prosecute in the event that you need to use that information as evidence in the perpetration of a crime. But you also want to make sure you maintain the integrity of the logs. One of the steps in any hacker's steps of action is to cover your tracks. So if I can compromise the logs and delete logs and modify logs to do so, then I would, because then my attack posture is effectively protected, because not only do you not know that I attacked, you don't know how I did it either. All right. You also want to make sure that you don't fall into the area of paralysis by analysis. A lot of times companies and organizations will feel like the more that I log, the better off I'm going to be, right? Because I'd rather capture more information than less information. And in that case, that could be actually counterintuitive because you've captured so much information that it's very difficult to identify what information is relevant or what information is relevant to your case versus what's kind of noise, if you will. All right. All right. User access management, also classified as an administrative control. There has to be a formal process for controlling and allocating credentials within your organization. Traditionally in the past, it was kind of always just a username and a password. Now it's much more complex. We have public key cryptography. We've got common access cards with digital certificates installed on them. We have different types of multi-factor authentication and so on. But from an administrative perspective, even though a lot of those things I just described are more technical components, from an administrative perspective, we are talking about implementing things like onboarding and offboarding procedures, having a standard set of guidelines or procedures for hiring individuals and firing individuals, verifying that individuals have access pertinent or relevant to their job function or their job role. Is there a written statement of understanding of that their access is conditional? They're expected to react or respond in a certain way based on being given that responsibility and the access. What are the revocation procedures if we fire an individual or an individual moves off to a different department, and so on. Again, we will implement technical controls for access management, but from an administrative perspective, there are aspects as well. Password management. You think of password management, you think of technical controls, right? Because we have password databases, we have key stretching techniques, hashing techniques for storing passwords on a local machine, that kind of thing. But defining the password policy, setting the password rules. There's some common rules here. You can only use temporary passwords once. That is called a nonce, by the way, a number that can only be used once. Passwords are never stored in plain text. They should have a specific complexity requirement. They should be changed regularly. There should be lockout policies in place. Password history should be maintained. Passwords are never disclosed, etc., etc. Now, that is a policy, so that the policy is the administrative component, but we implement that through configuration, which is the technical piece. All right. All right, make sure that the policies that you implement are consistent. You have very defined password policies, well-implemented controls. Obviously consider technical considerations. Things like implementing advanced authentication methods like multi-factor authentication and so on would be preferred over just standard authentication. Privilege management from an administrative perspective, as well as just really defining the process for allocating privileges to individuals. The actual implementation of privilege management is done by, with technical means, but we need to align access for individuals based on what their job function is or what their job role is. We do not want to assign aggregate rights. Meaning that they would get kind of more blanketed rights to access systems as opposed to controlled and directed rights based on specific job functions. All right. What are logical controls? Anything that involves technology, right? Firewalls, filters, operating system, patching software, routing protocols, or implementing protocols securely. Using secure access methods. So instead of using TFTP, using FTPS, or instead of using HTTP, using HTTPS, these would be considered logical controls. Remote access systems, access to systems themselves, malware control, encryption, all considered technical controls. Network access. Probably the most common element of network access control today is something called Xero Trust, where instead of traditional network access, you've got a desktop in your cubicle. That desktop is attached to the network and the port is configured to allow that desktop to communicate. we're not going to trust any device that's attaching to the network. We're going to do a posture assessment. We're going to profile that device. As soon as the port activates, we're going to use an IEEE function called 802.1x to do network-based authentication and control. And then we're going to authorize that port based on those assessments, right? So we don't trust anything anymore that attaches to the network. Anything like access control lists, virtual local area networks, access control protocols, intrusion prevention systems, technology basically is going to fall under the realm of network access, logical controls for network access. MAC filtering, network access control using 802.1x, antivirus, and so on. For remote access, probably the most common implementation is either SSL or TLS VPN or IPsec VPN for site-to-site VPN implementations, providing confidentiality, integrity, authentication, and availability based on implementing technologies. System access includes access to all communication-related systems. The most common is some sort of authentication using user ID and password. I would even say that that's probably not that common anymore. We're using other enhanced methods of authentication, which include multi-factor authentication. We'll get into a discussion of what multi-factor authentication is a little bit later on. Operating systems internally, and we'll talk about this in a different domain, but they employ controls between the components of the systems. The kernel or the core of the operating system is protected from the peripherals and the ancillary applications that run on that device using the ring trust model that we'll talk about a little bit later on. That's what they're referencing in that second to last bullet point as well. Strict control to programs with access to the operating system kernel. File systems use controls as well. Protect files, read only, read write, execute, full, access, etc., or no access. Applications and users and system controls are implemented to supplement other controls. For example, you have monitoring sessions, inactivity timeouts, some way of validating data entry by using methods for input validation, error handling techniques that don't result in the exposure of additional information, limiting access to services based on user rights, rule-based access control or role-based access control. We have to integrate these types of security components to ultimately protect the end users and the systems. All right. And applications are very often segmented in design. We'll look at in domain 8, the software development lifecycle and how security is incorporated into software applications. All right. Malware, another type of control. I don't have to say a whole lot about this. We understand what malware is. Malware is anything that's not wanted, essentially any software application that's not wanted. It comes in the form of a virus, a worm, a Trojan, spyware, spam, etc. And of course, we have to have technical controls to mitigate the infection and propagation of those types of things within our system. We can do file integrity checking to verify that files haven't been modified in transit or during a download. We can implement host-based intrusion prevention systems and intrusion detection systems, as well as network-based. We can also include things like forensic file analysis. That would be something similar to doing like a sandbox analysis, launching an application in a protected zone, which is called the sandbox, to see how that application responds. Real-time integration with vendors, and developers with security in mind. That's the key. We want to make sure that security is something that we're focused on. Cryptography. Yes, we are going to spend a lot of time talking about cryptography. That is domain number 3. Quite an extensive discussion of cryptography. Obviously, cryptography comes in many forms. Cryptographic functions not only include confidentiality functions, but they include non-repudiation functions, origin identification functions, authentication, integrity, etc. And trust me, we will spend a lot of time discussing that, quite a bit of time. It can be used as a compensating control, but the idea of cryptography, well, it goes beyond confidentiality because hashing algorithms are considered to be cryptographic functions, but hashing algorithms are used to protect, the integrity of a file system or whatnot. Okay. All right. Now, as we have talked about throughout all of our discussions on assessments and controls and risk, we always talk about the ability to measure and monitor the effectiveness of these controls. So having some sort of assessment in place is critical to understand the effectiveness of what it is that we're implementing over time, because that effectiveness might actually change as we talked about. Now, the assessments may be required in order for us to be compliant or considered compliant, but generally speaking, assessments would be done to ensure that, that we have effective controls in place. The assessment principle is to verify the operators are meeting specific security goals, that the objectives of the controls are being implemented, and that they're operating correctly, and they're producing the expected outcome, based on what the reason for implementing that particular control was. So what is the effectiveness of the control? What is the quality of the risk management process? Was the end result what we expected based on the initial design or the initial assessments? What are the strengths and the weaknesses of those controls that are put into place? So, and again, it's a very critical aspect to managing these controls in our environment. The findings are going to be used to determine the overall effectiveness of our security controls. We're going to be able to validate the security controls in our security plan and provide some action or some way of correcting any weaknesses that we identified. We have to tailor the assessment to the environment that the control has been implemented in. And assessments themselves will add a level of complexity. Certainly, they're going to add some cost to the process. So you have to be very selective as to what types of assessments you're going to include. Supplementation includes adding assessment procedures or assessment details to meet the risk management needs. Now, the assessment itself won't necessarily assist us in meeting our management needs, our mitigation needs or our control needs. It's the result of that assessment, that feedback from that assessment back into the overall evaluation of the system that will result in assessing whether or not the controls are effective. Now, of course, part of all of this and the precursor to doing all of this, implementing the controls and mitigating risk and reducing risk to an effective level, is that we have to be able to do some sort of vulnerability assessment. A vulnerability assessment is a way for us to identify inherent weaknesses in systems that can be exploited by threat actors to gain access to systems, to steal intellectual property, or to prevent systems from operating. Basically an attack on that CIA triad that we talked about previously. System operations that occur within the context of our business, they need to be discussed with business units. Stakeholders need to operate include their input. They're the ones that are most affected by the functionality of these systems and the operation of these systems. But vulnerability assessments can, we typically think of vulnerability assessments from a technical standpoint, right? Assessing systems based on weaknesses of controls for, being infected with malware or virus or whatever. But again, this applies to every type of asset in your organization. Once business components are identified, we have to look at the sources of the security and industry information. There are specific verticals and specific type of business entities that exist that would collect threat modeling data from these threat information sources specific to an industry. So the same types of threats that might exist for a hospital would be different than the types of threats that would exist for a bank, so to speak. So we would rely on threat information sources and security information sources that are relevant to the business sector that we're in. We examine the controls protecting those systems, policies, technology, firewalls, antivirus, and so on. We match those controls against previously discovered threats. Once we've matched those controls, we identify the gaps that exist between what the threat is and how much protection the control offers for that particular system. We can use automated tools to identify vulnerabilities, things like a SCAP scanner, automated tools to do network enumeration or firewall enumeration, and so on to identify out of compliance systems. Basic scanners to check for the appropriate patches for an operating system, or the signature definition file for an IPS or IDS system, and so on. We take the results of these assessments, whether they're automated tools or not automated tools, and we use that as feedback into our overall risk analysis process to ensure that we're mitigating that additional risk down to an acceptable level. Now, they do mention something here. I skipped over it because I want to talk about this for a second. False positives may result in services in the network required for businesses. Let me read that again. False positives may result in services in the network required for businesses. I believe there's a word missing there. False positives may result in the interruption of services in the network that are required for business. So let's talk about this term false positive. There's basically 4 different terms that are related to this. Well, 3 others plus this one. True positive, true negative, false positive, false negative. And you'll see these terms on the exam, and these are terms that we're going to also see throughout the rest of the course. True positive, true negative, false positive, false negative. Now, depending on how these terms are being applied, what the context of the application is, and we'll see this again later on, but generally speaking, the way that you analyze what is good and what is bad, when an action is taken and when an action is not taken, is that true is good, false is bad. Okay? True negative, true positive, these are expected and desired actions. False negative, false positive are not expected or undesired actions. Okay? So if you see true, it's a good thing. If you see false, it's a bad thing. Positive versus negative. Positive means that an action was taken. Whatever the desired action is, it could be blocking a packet, it could be resetting a TCP connection, it could be closing a door, whatever. Doesn't matter what it is, but some action is taken. Somebody being allowed access to the facility based on their hand geometry scan or something like that. Negative means an action was not taken. So positive, an action was taken. Negative, an action was not taken. So, that being said, a true positive. An action was taken when we wanted it to be taken. So, I have a antivirus application running on a computer, and I'm doing a scan. A true positive would mean that I actively identified a virus and I quarantined that virus, or I got rid of that virus. That would be considered a true positive. True negative, I did a scan, I did not find a virus, so I did not take any action. Okay? Let's talk about it from the perspective of gaining access to a physical facility like a data center. You walk up, you put your hand on the palm vein scanner, you put in your PIN code, and you get access. Now that could be considered a true positive if the action of giving access is what is intended. But what if it is a erroneous reading? Maybe you don't have enough data points to uniquely identify the individual, and you have multiple individuals that match the set of data points that you collected. So a false positive means that you gave somebody access when you weren't supposed to. If the action was giving access. Now the action could be denying access as well. It really depends on the perspective that you look at. So a false positive could be denying action or denying the ability for somebody to access the data center when they should have been authorized to access the data center. A false negative is perhaps, potentially could be the worst type of action, depending on how it's applied to the scenario, but you did not take an action when you should have. Certainly if we're talking about an antivirus application, you scanned, you did not identify the virus, even though there was a virus, and you didn't take action, that would be a very bad thing, right? So false negative in the context of granting access to a data center. I am an authorized user. I go and scan my hand. The false means something bad. Negative means I was not granted access. Again, it really depends on how you're applying it to the scenario. But in the end, false is bad, true is good. Positive means some action was taken. Negative means some action was not taken. And that's the way we kind of differentiate those. All right. Penetration testing. There's obviously different types of penetration testing that are available. Penetration testing can be, ethical or non-ethical. We can have a red team, a blue team, a purple team. I can define kind of these concepts, right? Red team and blue team and so on. A red team, as an example, is a group that would, in essence, play a role of an enemy or a competitor. So in the context of cybersecurity, it's somebody that's acting as a hacker, right? In cybersecurity, penetration tests involve ethical hacking, basically trying to break into a computer system with no element of surprise. The blue team is the defending team. They're aware that the penetration test is occurring, and they're the ones that are responsible for mounting the defense. The red team actually takes it a step further. They add social engineering, they add an element of surprise, they add physical penetration. The blue team is really given no advanced warning that the red team exists, and they're going to treat it as a real intrusion. All right. Now, red team assessments are very similar to penetration testing. So there is a distinction between the term penetration testing and red team versus blue team. The red team assessment is very similar to a penetration test, but it tends to be more targeted. The goal is to test the organization's ability to detect the attack and how it responds and what its response capabilities are. So we'll try to gain access to sensitive information, much like a real attacker might do. Okay, a purple team, which we don't see on the slide here, but a purple team is really a team that can kind of oversee both teams. They can provide information response during the test. We don't need necessarily a separate team. It's just the red and blue teams kind of communicating together with each other. And we'll get into some of the other terms as well that are relevant to penetration testing. Just understand the difference between the blue team and the red team in this particular case. Okay? Now, with regard to penetration testing, the goal is to obviously identify weaknesses within a system, and that can be done in various ways. We don't even have to be, doing some sort of penetration testing. Oops, let me switch back to the right slide here. There we go. I don't know why that keeps popping up. There we go. All right. Penetration testing is referred to as ethical hacking. You have a tiger team, red teaming, vulnerability testing. The idea is that we're simulating attacks on systems with the idea that we're evaluating the risk to the system. We have to have the appropriate skills, of course. We have to have the time. And we're trying to identify, in essence, these concepts as well. What is the level of impact? What type of privileges did I gain access to? What was the depth of the attack? All right. Primarily focused on internet systems and services, anything that is publicly facing, but penetration testing can also be done internally as well. Prior to testing, we have to identify what the objective of the test is, what is the scope of the test, what are the goals of the test, and then what kind of resources are required for that test. All right. There are different strategies in penetration testing, and I don't know that you'll have to know this specifically, but the terms are kind of self-explanatory. But the strategies are combinations of how we're implementing the test, how the assets are targeted within the organization. We have zero knowledge, partial knowledge, or full knowledge testing. And we see that we have a blind testing, double blind testing, and lights on. The key here is how is the information being provided to the tester before the test begins. So blind testing, we have minimal knowledge of systems and resources. So this would be almost like a black box type of test where we have to use public information to get information about a system or about a target, publicly accessible information. So we'll do our reconnaissance, look at whois records, DNS records, etc. But we have very little knowledge. However, the IT department knows that the test is taking place. A double blind means that the IT department is unaware that the test is actually being performed, and it's almost kind of like a simulated attack, where we have to not only gauge the controls that are in place, but how the IT department responds to the attack. How well are systems being monitored? How well do we identify the incident? How well do we respond to containment, etc., etc. A targeted test or a lights-on test means that everybody is aware of the testing and we're really focused on the function of the platform. It's not a tabletop exercise. It's not a simulated environment exercise. We're really just simply trying to identify weaknesses in a particular system. So what are the phases of penetration testing? Initially, we want to gather information about the target. This is what we refer to as reconnaissance, the act of gathering important information about the target system or the target asset that we're trying to test. That information will then hopefully provide us a better understanding of the system that we are trying to attack, and hopefully will allow us to essentially identify attack vectors and potential vulnerabilities in that particular system. Reconnaissance can be passive or it can be active. Typically, reconnaissance is passive. You know, we're looking at public records, internet searches, social media, if we're trying to perpetrate some sort of social engineering attack, publicly accessible information, and so on. Another type of attack is what we call a scanning attack. Now, we can do active scanning or we can do passive scanning. A active scanning attack is where we're actually using things like port scanners. We're using a Christmas tree packet, or manipulating TCP flags or whatnot to see how systems react to the scan. A ping scanner, for example. So we're actually not only sending out data, but we're expecting to get some sort of response. Port scanning, for example, I will send out TCP SYN requests on specific ports, and if I get a TCP reset, I know that that particular host is not responding on that particular port. All right. Whereas if I get a TCP SYN ACK, I know that that port happens to be open on that particular host. A Christmas tree attack is where I simply set all the flags, essentially every flag, the SYN flag, the ACK flag, the urgent flag, the push flag, the fin flag, the reset flag. Every one of them is set. I just want to see how how the host responds. This is called a TCP/IP stack fingerprinting attack, to identify how a host responds to a particular type of attack. Passive scanning, a little bit harder to define. Typically passive scanning is often defined the same way as active scanning, meaning that we're not trying to penetrate systems, we're not trying to intercept data, we're just kind of seeing what's going on the network, right? Or in the system that we're trying to attack or gain information about. Gaining access, this is exploiting functions of the system to actually gain access to that system, bypassing authentication or using some sort of secondary authentication method. Metasploit takes advantage of various weaknesses in a system. It is a tool that is available independently, but it's also part of packaged platforms like Kali Linux and so on. So it does penetration testing, IDS signature verification. Rapid7 was the company that developed it, but the Metasploit framework is used for executing exploit code against target machines. There's some other kind of spin-offs to that as well, but you don't need to know in this particular class the specific frameworks of these different attack tools. You don't need to know that there's 900 different exploits in Metasploit, and you can configure payload code to simulate different exploits and so on. But it is just one of those tools that exists. If you go to the website SEC Tools, sechtools.org. You can see a list of all of the very common penetration testing and network enumeration and scanning tools that exist. And it gives you an idea of what each of those tools are, how they're utilized, and so on. But gaining access means that we're actually gaining access. It could be for the purposes of gaining access to that particular system, or it could be simply for the purpose of using that system as a pivoting point to attack other systems in the enterprise. Maintaining access could be important as well. Our attack may have to occur over time, requiring us access for a period of time to be able to steal relevant information. And then certainly covering our tracks at the end would be important as well. If I want to continue to utilize those methods and those techniques to attack, I don't want individuals understanding how that attack was facilitated so that I can continue to use those techniques. And also I want to protect my anonymity as well. So what is black box testing? Now, as the name implies, black box testing means that we are just looking at or examining the functionality of a system without understanding its internal workings, essentially. And this can be done with software development and software testing. It can be done with user acceptance testing, system integration testing, and so on. But in the case of cybersecurity, it's essentially penetration testing where the ethical hacker really has no knowledge of the system that's being attacked. And the goal of the black box penetration test is to simulate an external hacking or cyber warfare attack, assuming that the attackers on the outside would have little or no knowledge about a particular system. All right. Gray box testing, by definition, means that we have some knowledge of the system. Maybe it's a topology diagram. Maybe we understand maybe the version of software that's running on the platform, some IP address information. We don't have full access to the system, but we have some access to the system. All right. So access and knowledge levels of a user, potentially when elevated privileges are executed on the system. We have some knowledge of the internal workings of that particular system. And it is the intent of this assessment is not to act as a hacker on the outside, but with limited information, maybe even somebody internally, being able to focus our assessment efforts on some of the greater risks of that particular platform and so on. All right. So gray box, we have some information, but not all the information. White box testing means that we have complete knowledge of the system. There we go. Sorry about that. White box testing means that we have all the documentation. We know that the system exists. We know what kind of software. We might even have, administrative accounts or access accounts to that particular platform. The goal of a white box test, often called, it can be called glass box testing or transparent box testing as well, is that we are providing tests to determine the internal functioning or working of a system. The white box testing is really done from an internal perspective of the system as well. We choose specific inputs to see the results of those particular inputs. But the idea is that we have, specific knowledge about the system, whether it's the source code for an application, the operating system, the interaction of that operating system with other operating systems in the environment. But we know everything about the system. And there are different levels of white box testing, unit testing, We do unit testing to ensure that the system is working as it's intended before integration happens with other systems within our environment. We have integration testing, which is also considered white box testing. We're at this level, we're testing the interaction of interfaces of that system with other systems. And then we have regression testing. Regression testing is a term that we see quite a bit. It's also considered a white box test where we actually use what we call recycled white box test cases to kind of test the platform. I wouldn't say backwards necessarily, but with multiple tests that are already been previously run. In penetration testing specifically, because that's what we're talking about in this particular case, white box testing really just refers to a method where the white hat hacker, meaning somebody that has full knowledge of the system that's being tested, right? Or in this case, quote unquote, being attacked. The goal generally of a white box penetration test is to simulate a malicious insider, right? That malicious insider, we assume, would have some knowledge of the system. They might even have some credentials that give them access to that system and so on. All right? All right. Application security and DOS testing. Application security testing evaluates the controls inside of an application, understanding how that application interacts with other applications or internally within the processes of the computing environment. If we're using confidentiality mechanisms or integrity mechanisms, testing the effectiveness of those mechanisms. Authentication of users, testing the how authentication is applied to the application and if it's effective. The flow of information through the application. Testing whether or not the application is susceptible to denial of service attacks, distributed denial of service attacks as well. Typically, application testing, DOS testing, is not done on production systems because certainly a DOS test would affect the overall function of that system. But again, we are trying to identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities in a system so that we can then put in mitigating controls to protect against those types of vulnerabilities, right? War dialing, we saw this in the movie War Games, right? In the very beginning of the movie, he's dialing different computers and seeing how they respond, and then he gets connected to the Whopper. And Joshua, I don't know if you guys remember that movie or not. I'm 50 years old, so I remember that movie. Yeah, not talking about the new version, the old version. It was much better. Go ahead.
No, I was just concurring. It's a great movie. One
of my
all-time favorites.
It is. It is. So yeah, the global thermonuclear war. Yeah, it was a great movie. But war dialing is just a technique where I kind of automatically scan telephone numbers. Obviously this is not as common as it used to be. We don't typically use telephones in our computing environments too much anymore. But we would, look for connections to bulletin board systems or fax machines, or in the case of Matthew Broderick, the Whopper. The idea was that we were able to identify modems and we can connect. The modern form of war dialing, of course, is war driving, right? Where you're driving around and you're looking for open wireless connections so that you can connect and authenticate to those open wireless systems and scan those networks. I remember back in the day when wireless access points were built and distributed, they had no security by default. They were just open. So the idea was that it was plug and play. You take your wireless access point, you plug it into your network, and it would automatically start working. And but obviously, in that sense, now you had all these open wireless networks that existed around the community, and you could connect to any of those wireless networks. And then you can use various really basic scanning tools to see what kind of devices exist on the network. I remember at one point, I was at my girlfriend's house, and I did a scan, and I found a neighbor's wireless network connected to it. I did a network scan. They had an IP-enabled printer on their network. I added the printer to my computer, and I printed a bunch of pages saying secure your wireless network. So I think it was like 1,000 pages I printed or something like that. So I don't know. They did have their network secure after that, but I don't know how many of those pages actually printed. But war driving is really the searching of wireless networks. It's called war driving because, typically you would do this driving around in a car using a smartphone or a laptop, and you would be looking for open SSIDs. But, it could be war walking, it could be war biking or war cycling. It doesn't matter how you're actually, doing it. But war driving kind of originated from that concept of war dialing. And almost everybody kind of references that film, War Games, for that because it was so prevalent in the beginning of that movie. All right. There's like this whole underground, or there used to be this whole underground of symbols and characters that people would write on sidewalks or whatnot. If they found an open wireless network, they would identify, what the authentication method was, what the frequency was, what maybe you got access to, and so on. There's lots of different software applications in SSI, DER, Insider, iStumbler, Kismac, NetSpot, NetStumbler. These are all kind of very common applications that are used for identifying open wireless networks. Wireless network testing. Obviously, wireless in the past has always introduced concerns for security, particularly when we were talking about, we'll get into this in our cryptography discussion in Domain 3, but issues with weak encryption standards like wired equivalent privacy. Even though it had a fairly robust key for its time, it had weaknesses in its implementation, the initialization vector weaknesses, and so on, that made it less secure. And so with the advent of WPA, Wi-Fi protected access, WPA2, WPA3, we see that security is much more effective. Social engineering testing, really, really important. I have a story about this. I live in Santa Clarita, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. And they film a lot of westerns and a lot of different kind of outdoor movies and shows. I think Westworld was filmed there, and a lot of westerns and so on. But there's this extension to the Disney film studio out there where they film a lot of their outdoor stuff. But it's kind of an obscure lot. You literally just drive up this hill and you turn on this dirt road, and you go down this dirt road, and then all of a sudden you're in this whole back lot with houses and sets and everything else. And I thought, you know what? I'd like to go check that out and see what it looks like. So I went down the dirt road, and there's a guy in a vehicle, a security guy in a vehicle at the end of the dirt road. But as I'm driving down the dirt road, I seeing all these signs with arrows on them that said roar. It was some theatrical thing or some Actors Guild thing. They were having a meeting or something like that at the facility. And so when I pulled up to the security guy, I said, I'm here for roar. And he said, okay, you need to go over to that trailer and sign in, and then they'll tell you what to do. Okay, so I drove, and there was a parking lot with a trailer, and there was another security guard sitting at the gate to get into the facility, which was on the other side of the parking lot. And I waved at that security guard, and I parked my car, and I walked around to the side of the trailer. Thankfully, the entrance of the trailer was not visible to the security guard. And I stood next to the trailer for a couple of minutes, and then I walked back to my car, and I threw some papers up on the dashboard, and I just waved at the second security guard and drove through. He, I guess, assumed that I had signed in. Didn't verify any credentials, and I drove around the lot for like 2 hours. I watched him film a couple of scenes and walk through the sets, and just had a good time. So that is the concept of social engineering, right? Oftentimes, if you pretend that you belong, people will believe it, right? You have to look the part. You have to act the part. If you act suspicious or look suspicious, most likely they won't. They will not let you in. There was one video, TikTok video or YouTube video I saw, where these two kids said that they had read that if you're carrying a ladder, they'll always let you in. So they tried to just carry a ladder. They put on some high visibility vests and some hard hats and grabbed a ladder, and sure enough, they're walking around, and security guards are opening doors, and they're getting access to different events because they're carrying this ladder around. It's like, why would somebody carry a ladder unless they're supposed to be here doing work, right? So social engineering is a very, very common method of attack. It's an attack on the psychology and the manipulation of individuals, particularly the manipulation of individuals that have generally the propensity to help and to do good. Human nature is to be helpful, I think, for the most part. Again, if you act like you belong, or you ask the right questions or look the part, you'll get away with a lot of different things. Just don't post it on social media, because then they can come after you. There was that kid that was able to get into, it wasn't necessarily, I guess it was kind of social engineering, but he had gotten into all of the major sporting events for a year. The Super Bowl, Game 7 of the NBA Finals, the McGregor-Mayweather fight in Vegas, and he would show up to the event 2 days before or a day before, wearing some contract construction vest or something like that, or clipboard or something, and the security was much more lax in those times. And he would find a place within the facility to hide and essentially camp out for the night, and then he would basically get to go to the event as long as he wasn't found. But then he posted it on, he was a citizen, he lived in New York, and he posted it on social media, and the Attorney General of New York basically had him arrested and fined and stuff like that, because he posted everything on social media, but essentially admitting to the crime. I'm sure everybody here has some example of some social engineering experiment that they did at some point or another. Whether it was for cybercrime or not, that's a different scenario. But we've all probably experienced either being socially engineered or socially engineering somebody at some point. Reconnaissance and discovery. We understand what this is. We've talked about this on our previous slide. Doing ping sweeps, whois lookups, internet searches, gathering information, dumpster diving, still considered to be an effective reconnaissance mechanism, right? Going and looking at somebody's trash. Now, granted, from a technological standpoint, not very effective, but for personal information gathering, can still be pretty effective. People are pretty relaxed when it comes to throwing away information or documents and whatnot that are relatively, should be considered relatively private. We want to gather as much information about the target without detection, That's the idea. It's the old adage of scoping out or analyzing the scene before you rob a bank. How often do the guards rotate? How many guards are there? When do they open the doors, etc.? When is the busiest time versus the non-busiest time, and so on. So it could be looking at physical layouts, virtual layouts. It's funny that I watch a lot of these audit security audit videos where the First Amendment right auditors and whatnot. I don't know why I find them so fascinating, but I do. It's kind of interesting. And they'll go out and they'll film a prison, or they'll film a police station or whatever, but they always do it from the public areas, right? The street or a public sidewalk or something like that. And inevitably, you always have people coming out, cops or security officers or whatever. You cannot film here, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the whole, well, you're violating my First Amendment right, the freedom of the press. I'm in a public area, and there's no expectation of privacy in a public area. I think if I get older and I retire, I think that's probably what I'd like to do, just annoy people and create a YouTube channel and do that. But ultimately, that could be considered reconnaissance. I can understand why people would be concerned, if you're filming a police station or whatnot. But, they make good points. They say, well, I can go on Google Maps and see the same thing. So what's the difference? I'm not stepping on your property. I'm not violating, any laws and so on. It's kind of interesting. If you guys have ever seen those audit videos, they're kind of interesting. Some of those guys are kind of jerks, but anyway. What is enumeration? By definition, enumeration is the activity where we're trying to learn information about a system, right? It could be firewall enumeration or network enumeration. Anything that we're trying to gain information about is considered enumeration. It's just a fancy term, to describe, how we're essentially identifying a system, right? It could be if it's a computing system, right? Trying to find information about the groups or the shares that a computer system might have. Network mapping could be considered a type of enumeration. Fingerprinting an operating system. Being able to identify potentially what type of software is running on that system and so on. Metasploit, Nmap, Nessus, OpenVAS, Saint, ZMAP. These are all different types of network enumeration tools. It is not network mapping, right? I want to make that a point to recognize here. We only retrieve information about which servers are connected to specific networks and what operating systems are running on those particular networks. On those particular systems. Now, that being said, it depends, right? If you're defining enumeration as network enumeration, we're not necessarily trying to identify what types of devices exist on the network or exactly what the topology looks like, but maybe we're trying to identify what operating system the routers are running or the switches are running for the purposes of identifying weaknesses in those particular platforms. That would still be considered enumeration. Vulnerability analysis, we analyzed the data that we gathered in our reconnaissance phase and the enumeration to determine vulnerabilities of a system. Knowing that this operating system is Windows 10 and it's been patched to this level, I can then go and look at documented vulnerabilities. And we just simply compare the information that we collected to potential vulnerabilities that might exist. We can use public websites, vendor publications, hacker websites, hacker periodicals, patch information, etc., to identify potential holes in those platforms for exploitation. And that's really kind of the same goal. It's really no different than what you would do in your risk assessment process internally to be able to identify weaknesses in your systems and so on. The only difference here is that we're doing it for the purposes of gaining access to a system. The next phase is the execution phase. This is where we actually execute the attack, right? We've identified the systems, we've identified the vulnerabilities, we've identified the different attack scenarios, so we plan the actual execution of the attacks. And it could be for the purposes of gaining access to a system, using a weak system to pivot to a less weak system, privilege escalation, denial of service, distributed denial of service. There are many, many different types of executed attacks that can take place. But the idea is that we're actually achieving our goal, whatever that goal might be, to gain access to a particular system. Okay? Once it's executed, we document our findings. In the case of, white hat hacking, if you want to say it that way, or red teaming, we document our findings for the purposes of ensuring that we're protecting these systems based on these findings, right? Collect and analyze the findings, identify the state of security that we have within our enterprise. We present those findings to individuals that are responsible for maintaining that system. And then we would then, what are the gaps in the security measures? What are our response capabilities? How did we respond to the attack? What are the logs? And then what are and this is the ultimate goal, what are the security countermeasures that we're going to implement to mitigate these potential risks for the future? And as a internal auditor, that's ultimately the goal, right? How do we value assets? We talked about this previously, right? Assets are valued based on their value to the organization. Physical devices might have a zero value, hard drives and computers because of depreciation, but there's always value to the information as well. So we have to understand replacement cost. We have to understand operational cost. The original cost is always probably going to be less if it's a physical asset because of depreciation. There might be different market values. We might say, for example, if we're just talking about physically replacing devices that might fail over time, we can't get device A, but we can get device B that fulfills the same function. We would get quotes and gain an understanding of what the value of those assets are. All right. Intangible assets, things like intellectual property, trademarks, creative works, business processes, brand identity, brand recognition. These are very difficult to determine the value. So it's somewhat qualitative or somewhat kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily a guess, but you might understand that you have a percentage of market share in a particular business vertical. And if brand reputation is affected, you might lose 20% of your market share. That's a calculable value, right? As far as replacing assets, how do you replace, a business process that's exposed? Some secret business process that gives you a competitive advantage that gets exposed. There's really no way to replace that. You lose that advantage. There's a dollar value associated to that, having that advantage. All right. The PDCA process, not related specifically to what we were talking about previously, but the Plan, Do, Check, Act, or what we call the Plan, Do, Check, Adjust process, is an iterative design and management method. And it's used in business for the control and, I would say, the continuous improvement of whatever processes or products that you have within your business, right? It can be called, I don't know that they will reference this on the exam, but the Deming circle or Deming wheel, the Short cycle, the PDSA or Plan, Do, Study, Act method or whatnot. All right. But the emphasis is with this particular model is plan, right? Establish the objectives and processes required to deliver whatever result it is that you're trying to deliver. Do, carry out those objectives from the previous step that you identified in the plan. Check during this check phase the data and the results that are gathered from the do phase get evaluated, right? That's why it's called check. That data is compared to the expected outcomes to see the similarities of what you expected versus the differences of what you expected, to see whether or not there are any changes from the original test that you created. If the data gets placed into a chart, you can see those trends, and then the cycle would repeat. Appraisals and gap analysis are examples of the PDCA process. And then act or adjust is where we implement process improvement, right? That's why oftentimes it's referred to as adjust. Nonconformities, opportunities for improvement of a particular process, inefficiencies that you've identified in a process, other issues that result in outcomes that are less than optimal, you would want to act. Of course, you'd want to be able to identify the root cause. There is some sort of investigation done where you do discovery, you find out what the root cause is, and you modify the process then to resolve the whatever issue it is that you've identified. We always go through the reevaluation process. That reevaluation process ends the the actions of that phase, but then we kind of go through the process again. All right. So you can see here, the diagram kind of describes the plan, identify the problem, and plan, observe, and analyze, isolate the real causes, define the corrective actions. Do is where we prepare and apply and verify the application. Check, verify the results, compare those with our objectives. And then finally act, the standardization and consolidation, or the kind of the moving into the next stage of the plan. The fundamental principle of applying this method is iteration. And the cycle kind of ultimately brings us closer to our ultimate goal. So we don't run around this circle one time. We do it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times, whatever it might be. But we repeat that cycle until we get closer to our ultimate goal. All right. There are other related concepts, COBIT, the decision cycle, the intelligence cycle, the learning cycle, the lesson study cycle. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different types of processes. I'm sure you guys have heard of Six Sigma, total security management, maybe not, but, all of these kind of relate to the same concept. Different risk management frameworks. We already talked about what a risk management framework is. Provides a structured approach to identifying risk within our organization. We need to align the risk appetite with our risk strategy. We didn't talk a whole lot about risk appetite, but by definition, risk appetite is what is the risk that we're willing to accept within an organization. And that will determine what our risk strategy is. So we need to evaluate risk. We need to look at the alternatives, objectives, and ways to manage risk within our organization. And then we're going to enhance our risk response decisions, meaning how are we going to respond to these decisions of risk based on that risk appetite and how we identify the risk response that we're going to take. Are we going to avoid the risk? Are we going to reduce the risk? Are we going to share the risk, accept the risk, and so on? We talked about that concept previously. The goal of any kind of risk management process is to reduce loss, reduce operational surprises, and so on. We talked about that. All right. Identifying and managing multiple and cross-enterprise risk is important. Obviously, enhancing the deployment of capital to those things that are important to us is important as well. All right. COSO, another framework that exists. COSO is a risk management process that's basically divided into, there's multiple versions, but we see divided into 4 different categories, right? Strategic categories, these are our high-level goals aligned with our supporting our particular mission. Operations, which obviously directly relate to operations, right? Using resources to allocate resources to effectively manage risk within our organization, reporting and compliance as well. Remember, COSO is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, right? We talked about that previously. And we kind of defined, this framework, if you will. Now, like I said, there are 5 frame components. We can see them listed here, the control environment. As I mentioned previously, the control environment is really what kind of sets the tone for an organization. It's really the basis for all other components of internal control, and it defines the discipline, the structure that we're going to implement. Like I said, ethical values, the operational style of our administrators, how we delegate authority, deploying people within the organization. And then it goes down to risk assessment. And this is really obviously kind of self-explanatory, right? And risk assessment is expanded by itself into multiple subcategories, if you will. Event identification, objective setting, risk response, and so on. But every entity that exists has a variety of risks from both internal and external sources. And we have to address those risks. So risk assessment is really involves establishing the objectives of the assessment, identifying and analyzing risks relevant to whatever those assigned objectives are, and maybe even a process of predetermining how risks should be managed. We've talked about this multiple times already. We need to have clear objectives in order to be able to identify and assess the risks related to those particular objectives within our organization. We need to determine how the risks should be managed, right? Our risk appetite. We need to consider the potential for negative behavior or fraudulent behavior, and we need to monitor for changes that could impact the internal controls that we are implementing. The control activities are really just the policies and the procedures that help us ensure that management directives are going to be carried out. They ensure that we're taking the necessary steps to address the risk that may ultimately prevent us from achieving our overall objectives. And these activities would happen throughout the entire organization. They could be, authorization, verification, performance reviews, asset safety, segregation functions, etc. And we talked about information and communication, making sure that information is being presented to the stakeholders and the shareholders, and monitoring, continuous monitoring activities that could result in changes to the concept. Right now, you look at the 4 categories of business objectives that we see on the top. We're looking now at this box right here, which is really COSO 2, right? This was COSO 1, and this is COSO 2. We have 4 categories of business objectives: strategic, operations, reports, and compliance. The business risk management framework is still, even with the changes, aimed at achieving the objectives of the overall strategy. But we have these 4 different categories now. Instead of operations, reporting, and compliance, we have strategy. These are the high-level objectives. We align our policies with these, and typically these will be associated to the mission statement or the vision statement of the organization. We have operations. This would be the use of the actual resources within the organization that provides these functions. We have reporting. We need, reporting makes sense, right? Reliability of reporting is critical, but the reports provide feedback. And then we have compliance. Compliance would include concepts where maybe I have laws or regulations that I have to follow, and compliance would be, compliance with applicable laws and regulations. And then we see the 8 frame components below. All right. They encompass the 5 previous components that we saw in the IICF framework, right? We can see that internal control integrated framework versus enterprise risk management integrated framework at the bottom, right? I don't know that you'll see those terms on the exam, but that by definition is the representation of the model in this particular case. So we still encompass the 5 previous components, but we expand the model to meet additional requirements for risk management. So we have our internal environment. Again, that's still kind of the tone of the organization. How is risk perceived within the organization? What is the risk management philosophy? What is the risk appetite of the organization? What are the ethical values, integrity values of the organization? And how basically does the operation, how do we operate, right? Setting objectives, or objective setting in this particular case, has to exist before we can identify potential events that affect our overall goals, right? Business risk management means that we're trying to ensure that management has implemented processes to establish the objectives that were chosen, and that those objectives align with the overall mission, and that they are consistent with the appetite that we have for risk. Very important concept. Event identification, which is kind of an expansion of our risk assessment. These are all the internal and external events that have to be identified. And in this case, we often distinguish between risks and opportunities, and opportunities then get rechanneled into kind of our management strategy and our goal-setting process. The risk assessment piece is pretty self-explanatory. All right, what is the probability and impact? And of course, how should that be managed? This is the component where risks are inherently and residually addressed as part of our analysis. Risk response, do we avoid the risk? Do we accept the risk? Are we reducing or sharing the risk? And we, of course, have to take actions that are going to align with our risk appetite that we had previously defined. Control activities is no different than what we saw before. It's still the policies and procedures. Information and communication is the same, and monitoring is the same as well. All right. There are some specific limitations to this philosophy, but in general, it is kind of widely accepted. I don't normally spend as much time on this slide, but I thought it was important to kind of differentiate between the two platforms there, or the two distinct options. All right. I've already gone through all of these: internal environment, objective setting, event identification, risk assessment, risk response, control activities, etc. Again, these are the components of this box right here, specifically those objectives, if you will. And we've already kind of defined them in detail. All right. Other examples of frameworks: Information Systems Audit Control Association, ISACA. You can actually get certified in different ISACA principles. In fact, in a lot of these different organizations do provide different types of certifications to certify that you understand the principles of these guidelines and so on. ISACA itself is an international professional association. It was founded by IT governance, or information technology governance. It is the Information Systems Audit and Control Association, but generally they just go by their acronym now. You don't really see them listed in detail, but they have 8 different certification programs, and then they have some different micro certification programs. They've been around for a long time. In the 1960s, I think they were founded. They define, different certifications for different professionals. IS auditors, consultants, IS security professionals, chief information officers, chief information security officers, and so on. ISO 31000. 31000 are standards. Again, this is the International Organization of Standardization. This is the ISO 31000. This may be something that you have to know. Are standards relating to risk management. Okay, the latest is 2018, I believe. It's again another framework that allows us to identify risk management concepts. For example, 31000 specifically is risk management guidelines. 31004 are implementation principles of 31000. 31010. I don't have those listed on the slide here, but specifically defines how you implement risk assessments. 31022 would be legal risk and so on, and they have things like travel risk management. Vocabulary definitions. There's all kinds of different, I don't know if they really call them substandards, but they're part of the whole standard family. All right. I don't know. I would say that you probably don't need to know all of these elements. Just understand generally that the risk management framework for the International Standards Organization is under 31000. The scope of 31000, it's just a set of principles or guidelines, if you will, for the design and the implementation of a risk management framework in your organization. And you can be ISO certified if you follow these standards and principles. The one thing that I want to point out, I don't know if I have it in, I don't have it in here, but ISO defines risk management framework versus risk management process differently, right? The framework is the structure, the components that provide an organization the ability to design, implement, and improve or continuously or iteratively improve risk management within the organization. Risk management process, by definition, is the application of those policies, those practices, those procedures. So the process is the implementation, the work, if you will. All right. 31,000-2009, which is the first edition. I don't know why I put these in here. I don't think it's necessary to understand these details, but we'll go through it since it's here. Generic guidelines for risk management. Avoid risk by avoiding activities that give rise to risk. Accepting risk to pursue an opportunity might be prudent if it's financially viable. Remove the risk source, changing the likelihood of an attack, changing the consequences, so likelihood and impact. Sharing risk, retaining risk through informed decisions. I think the definitions themselves kind of give you an idea of the difference, right? The 31,000 2009 was developed based on an existing standard called an AS-NZS standard, which was, I don't know the number, I think it's 4,300 something, but 2009, 2009 addresses the whole cycle, the whole management system. We're talking the design, the implementation, the maintenance, the improvement of the overall risk management process. Okay? Generally speaking, we want to avoid risk by deciding not to start or to continue with an activity that might give rise to that particular risk. We can accept increasing risk, like I said, to pursue an opportunity, and so on. Contracts or risk financing could be done for option number 6 there, sharing the risk with another party. That's almost like transferring the risk, and so on. I'm assuming we're going to look at the second edition, 2018 version. Provides a more strategic guidance, places more emphasis on the involvement of senior management and the integration of risk management within basically the entire operation of the organization. Still provides principles and guidelines for design, implementation of the risk management framework, and recommendations for application of the risk management process. And we can apply, it's pretty generic, so we can apply it to any process or any decision-making component at any level. Here is the definition of framework versus process, right? Framework provides that structure. The process is the process of actually applying procedures and practices, like I stated. Okay, oops. There we go. The Nist management framework, or Nist risk management framework we talked about previously, 837, specifically applying risk management to federal information systems. We talked about that. 6 distinct steps for processing. We can actually take a look at that on the next slide. First of all, we categorize our information systems. That's pretty much how any assessment takes place. We need to identify what we're trying to protect. Step 2, we select the security controls that we wanted to put into place based on our risk appetite, based on the assets. Step 3, we implement those security controls. We assess the effectiveness of those controls, and then we authorize the system to be functional or to be placed into operation. And then we continually monitor those security controls to see, to maintain their effectiveness, or at least to identify whether they're still maintaining their effectiveness over time, right? And then repeat the cycle as needed. It's not necessarily something that you need to regurgitate for the exam, but you should know that the Nist risk management framework does typically apply